Well, hello dear comrades, and welcome back to our close readings of Naturalism and Religion by Graham Oppy. Today we read the 5th chapter of the book, Does Science Defeat Naturalism? Which is quite an odd question, right? If you watch old episodes until now, this would strike you as maybe nonsensical. For a reminder, naturalism is the conjunction of ontological naturalism, the claim that there are none but natural causal entities with none but natural causal powers, and methodological naturalism. Like, how can science defeat naturalism if one of the two essential characteristics of naturalism is methodological naturalism? That is, naturalism supposes that scientific method is our touchstone for identifying the denizens of causal reality. In other words, how can naturalism be at odds with science if it believes that causal reality is just as science says that it is? So the only way for this question to be answered with yes is that if you argue that science supports that there is more to causal reality than just natural reality. So since naturalism argues that natural reality exhausts causal reality, if science defeats naturalism, then science must support that natural reality doesn't exhaust causal reality, that there is also non-natural reality involved in causal reality. And so this is different from saying that there might be more to natural reality than our universe, or that our universe might belong to a wider universe. If our universe turns out to be not all of natural reality, like there is a multiverse, that wouldn't defeat naturalism because that remains within natural reality. If we ever discover such a multiverse, then we've just discovered other things of natural reality. But all is still within natural reality. But that doesn't matter here. We just focus on our universe and take it, for the entirety of natural reality. So it doesn't really matter. So what is science in relation to our universe? Well, it's an investigation of our universe. Each branch of science investigates an aspect of the universe. Physics investigates the physics of our universe, chemistry investigates the chemistry of our universe, biology investigates the biology of our universe, and so on. So the naturalism's claim is that physics is just as science says that it is, chemistry is just as science says that it is, and biology is just as science says that it is. And no, this doesn't mean what Dawkins, Rawlings, or any of the transphobes out there think it means, so chill out. Anyway, so the point is that none of the branches of science seem to study or identify non-natural entities in our universe. And naturalism simply says that there are no non-natural entities, only natural ones. So our universe exhausts causal reality. So there isn't a branch of science that says anything in conflict with naturalism. But some philosophers disagree with this prima facie implausibility of the claim that science defeats naturalism. And instead, they are certain that science actually defeats naturalism, that science also supports the existence of non-natural entities and powers. And this chapter will take a careful look at such arguments, namely Alvin Plantinga's argument that science supports theism and therefore defeats naturalism from his 2011 book, Where the Conflict Really Lies: Science, Religion, and Naturalism. We're actually going to make two videos because Plantinga provides two arguments. His first argument is that there is little and less conflict between science and theism than between naturalism and science. And another argument called the evolutionary argument against naturalism, or EAAN. We can just call it EAN. We'll focus on the first argument of this episode, which covers the first 8 sections of the chapter. So let's start with the background, which means what the argument rests on. So Plantinga's argument rests on 3 claims. First, that there is much merely alleged conflict between theism and science. 2, that there is superficial conflict but deep concord between theism and science. And 3, that there is superficial concord but deep conflict between naturalism and science. In other words, theism and science are closer to each other than naturalism and science, and therefore science supports more theism than naturalism. According to Plantinga, it's naturalism that is in deep conflict with science, not theism. Theism's conflict with science is just superficial. Now, how does Plantinga support the claim that the conflict between theism and science is just superficial? That would mean that the investigations of physics, chemistry, biology, psychology, etc., they support more the claims of theism than naturalism. And that's exactly what Plantinga claims, making some very controversial assertions that evolution, for example, has less conflicts with theism than with naturalism. That everything that criticizes biblical narratives is only superficial conflict. Like, even when historical accounts contradict biblical narratives, that's just superficial conflict. In other words, to support the three claims that theism is closer to science than naturalism is closer to science, Plantinga needs to prove the following 5 points, which again he claims to do. So, he needs to prove that A, there is merely alleged conflict between theism and evolutionary theory, and between science and the claim that God acts in the world. B, there is only superficial conflict between theism and evolutionary psychology, and between theism and historical biblical criticism. C, some parts of cosmology and molecular biology at least weakly support theism over naturalism. D, a range of considerations concerning reliability, regularity, simplicity, necessity, natural law, and mathematics very strongly support theism over naturalism. And E, there is deep conflict between naturalism and evolutionary theory. So if theism supports those claims while naturalism doesn't, it is necessary to define theism and naturalism from Plantinga's perspective. So according to him, theism is the claim that God exists and is the all-powerful, all-knowing, and perfectly good personal creator of the world. So that's the classical definition of God: omnipotent, omniscient, and benevolent. Then we have the definition of naturalism. For Plantinga, naturalism is also ontological or philosophical naturalism and methodological naturalism. But he defines ontological naturalism as the claim that there is no such person as God or anything like God, where this latter claim includes materialism with respect to human beings and excludes any other supernatural beings. And then you have the definition for methodological naturalism, which is divided into 2 categories. There is weak and strong methodological naturalism. Weak methodological naturalism says that a scientific evidence base does not include the proposition that there is such a person as God or some other supernatural being. And strong methodological naturalism says that the scientific evidence base includes the proposition that there is no such person as God or any other supernatural being. So you can understand the difference between weak and strong methodological naturalism like this. The weak one is more of an agnostic position. It doesn't assert the claim that God exists within its scientific database, but it doesn't assert that God doesn't exist either. It just suspends its judgment about whether there are beings beyond natural reality. So weak methodological naturalism can be, understood as naturalism minus ontological naturalism, whereas strong methodological naturalism affirms the claim that God doesn't exist and that there are no beings beyond natural reality. So strong methodological naturalism goes hand in hand with ontological naturalism. As for the notion of evidence base, that's just, the database that we are using when doing science. It's the set of belief that that person uses or appeals to in conducting an inquiry. It's the set of what you take to be evidence or your background knowledge that will determine how you will do inquiry, the direction of your research, etc. But what does inquiry consist of, according to Plantinga? Well, it's to evaluate hypotheses. My background knowledge, or the evidence base, is the set of tools that I will mobilize in conducting such evaluation. How do I evaluate a hypothesis? Well, for Plantinga, with the evidence base that I possess, some hypotheses will be more likely than others, meaning that they will get a higher probability. So let's read a quote from Plantinga. One of the main functions of one's evidence base is that of evaluating possible hypotheses. Some hypotheses will, given my background knowledge or evidence base, be very unlikely, perhaps so unlikely as not to be worth thinking about at all. It is important to see in this connection that the evidence base of a Christian theist will include theism, belief in God, and also the main lines of the Christian faith. Therefore, it will assign a high probability to hypotheses probable with respect to the Christian faith. So, the example of a Christian theist is that he will have an evidence base that includes at least Three things: theism, the belief that one God exists, the belief that the God in question is the Christian God, and the main lines of the Christian faith, including the work of the Holy Spirit, incarnation, resurrection, and atonement, that Jesus Christ is the divine Son of God, that he arose from the dead, and his suffering and death is in some way an atonement for human sin, that the Bible is divine discourse, that God is the principal author of the Bible, etc. So, these elements in the evidence base of the Christian cannot, of course, be arrived at with reason. But again, so is any starting point of inquiry. Plantinga isn't saying that the existence of God is the hypothesis that we have to evaluate. He's saying something else to avoid the charge of begging the question. Someone can say, hold on, theism cannot be in your evidence base if what's in your evidence base is the starting point of inquiry. Your inquiry is supposed to arrive at God's existence, not start with it. So that would be question begging, okay? That would be begging the question. Your conclusion was already presupposed in your premises. But Plantinga's argument is that, well, if you don't start with presupposing God, if you don't start with presupposing God, then you won't be able to do inquiry. You won't be able to prove or test any hypothesis, and that's why naturalism doesn't work. So that's the argument that Plantinga is trying to make. With the evidence base of a Christian, Plantinga argues that you will be able to give a higher probability to scientific hypotheses than with the evidence base of a naturalist. If you are doing science, then you have beaten naturalism, because in order to do science, which means giving higher probability to scientific hypotheses than over non-scientific ones, then you need to presuppose theism. So, science is the proof that theism is true and naturalism false, and thereby science defeats naturalism. That's what, Plantinga says at the end of the quote. Scientific hypotheses are more probable with respect to the Christian faith than they are with respect to naturalism. So scientific hypotheses have a higher chance of being true if you start with a Christian evidence base, with a theist evidence base. That means that in return, theism has a higher chance of being true than naturalism. Plantinga is basically a Bayesian. So a Bayesian is someone who approaches reasoning, belief, or decision-making using Bayesian probability, a framework named after the 18th century mathematician Thomas Bayes. At its core, being Bayesian is about how you update belief in light of new evidence. So instead of asking, is this statement true or false, a Bayesian asks, how confident should I be given what I already know and what I've just learned? So according to a Bayesian theist, the more scientific evidence I get, the stronger the belief in God, meaning theism becomes more probable. And the more probable it is, the more probable scientific hypotheses are. So the best move is to start with a high probability of your evidence base if it is theistic. First claim that it is highly probable that God exists before you get any new evidence, and then as new evidence comes in, that evidence will only reaffirm more your theistic belief, thereby growing its probability. As Oppy writes, Bayesians identify evidence base with probability distribution. Prior to the introduction of a new evidence, data, arguments, etc., Christian theists assign high probabilities to the claim that there are to the claims that are characteristic of Christian theism. So that's the background of the argument. But before we jump into the argument itself, there is a very notion in Plantinga's epistemology that we need to introduce, and that is the features of beliefs. The features of beliefs are beliefs that defeat previous beliefs. There are multiple ways the features defeat previous beliefs. We can divide them into two categories. There are rationality defeaters and there are warrant defeaters. We will start with the first defeaters, which Oppy defines from Plantinga as acquired beliefs which, if retained, rationally require adjustments to the stock of beliefs that are held prior to the acquisition of the beliefs in question. And these can be further divided into two subcategories: the rebutting defeaters and undercutting defeaters. So the rebutting ones are just stronger version of rationality defeaters. For example, if I initially believe proposition P, but then I acquire a new belief, a proposition Q, but that new belief contradicts P by entailing not P, then I have rebuted P. Q is then a rebuting defeater of belief P. So, a defeater is a new acquired belief that entails the opposite of a previous belief. Q entails not P, and thereby defeating P. So the weaker version of this, the undercutting defeater, is, well, Q doesn't have to entail not P to defeat P, but it can make it so that it is very unlikely that P and Q, meaning that they are both true. So there's another way, which is about, the reason for believing that P. I believe that P solely for reasons R, but if Q entails that reasons R are insufficient for reasonable belief that P, and so I reject P because Q showed me that I have insufficient reasons to believe in P, then Q defeated P. So here too, I have an undercutting version. I can say that if Q doesn't entail that R is insufficient to believe P, it can still make it that it is very unlikely both that Q and that reasons R suffice for believing that P. So again, Q defeats P by undercutting it rather than rebutting it. A third way to defeat P is instead of, going after the reasons, I can go after the degree of the belief. I believe that P to degree D solely for reasons R. But then Q shows up and tells me that my reasons R are insufficient for that degree D. With R, I should, for example, believe that P to another degree, let's say degree D prime, but D prime is smaller, lower, or inferior to D. In other words, I cannot have that degree of confidence in P giving my reasons R. If those are the reasons why I believe in P, those reasons aren't strong enough for me to be that confident in my belief. So Q shows me that my confidence isn't adequate to my reasons for believing P, so Q defeats P. And likewise, there is a weaker version of this defeat, that it is unlikely that Q and belief in P to degree D for reasons R. Now we can move on to warrant defeaters. So they are defined as features of circumstances that explain why giving true beliefs are not knowledge. So the defeaters make it that even if you have a true belief, that true belief can be rejected on the grounds that despite being true, it's not necessarily knowledge. So here we have a distinction between knowledge and true belief. And the difference is conditional. There are, some circumstances that make a true belief not knowledge. Now, warrant defeaters work as undercutting defeaters. They don't really rebut beliefs, but they just undercut them. That's obvious since, a rationality defeater, if it is a rebuttal, makes it that you cannot hold a certain belief true anymore. So we can only work with defeaters that undercut a belief rather than rebut it, since the rejected belief can still be true. However, unlike undercutting rationality defeaters, which reject the consistency of your reasons for believing P or the degree of confidence in P, an undercutting warrant defeater, or just warrant defeaters, since they are all undercutting, it defeats the defeater belief. So how does that work? Well, Oppy gives two examples, each exemplifying a type of warrant defeaters. There are defeater defeaters and defeater deflectors. So here's the first example, a defeater defeater. So you have a belief P solely for reasons R, but then comes along Q, which undercuts P either by rejecting your reasons to believe P or your degree of confidence in P. So this is a rationality defeater. But then comes along another new belief, belief that S, which defeats belief Q. So the consequences is that your belief that P is reinstated. So back when you had belief P for reasons R, you had a true belief, but you didn't have knowledge. That's why P was defeated. But if you have a belief that defeats the defeaters, of your initial belief, then we can assert that you don't just believe that P, you know that P. You now know that P. So you have now knowledge that P. You don't just have a belief that P that happens to be true. You know that P is true. In these circumstances, that person's acquisition of the belief that S is a defeater for the belief that P. The belief that S is a defeater for the belief that Q, where if undefeated, the belief that Q is a defeater for the belief that P. So that's a defeater. Now, deflectors, they don't defeat defeaters, but they defeat, they deflect, sorry. They don't defeat defeaters, but they deflect defeaters. In this case, you already have the belief that S prior to acquiring Q, so Q never defeated P, even if it is a rationality defeater in relation to Q, meaning that S may entail not Q, but it's a warrant defeater in its relation to P. So S deflects Q, it doesn't let it defeat that belief P. So that person's possession of the belief that S is a deflector for the belief that P. In the absence of the belief that S, that person's belief that P would suffer undercutting defeat in virtue of that person's acquisition of the belief that Q. So with this in mind, we can now jump into Plantinga's argument. We explained what he is trying to make the case for and what his epistemology rests on. As we said, his main claim is that the conflicts between science and theism are only superficial and merely apparent, that in reality theism has a deeper concord with science than naturalism has with science. So let's begin with the claim that theism has only superficial conflict with science. Plantinga doesn't deny that there is conflict between theism and science. Evolutionary psychology and historical criticism of the Bible do pose challenges to the main beliefs of Christians and theists, and Plantinga doesn't deny that. The Bible claims historical things like, specific events that we either don't find any historical record of, or that the historical evidence we find suggests otherwise, like, the Jews leaving Egypt led by Moses. The mainstream scholarly consensus argues that there is no direct archaeological or textual evidence for a mass exodus of hundreds of thousands of Jews from Egypt. The archaeology of Sinai and Canaan does not support the biblical scale or even, the chronology. Instead, many thinkers think the Exodus story is mythicized, composite, or based on much smaller historical memories, like, Semitic populations moving in and out of Egypt, but not with Moses or with the propositions in the Bible, or, with that, story of a sea that opened, right? Plus, it's strange and suspicious that no records of such events were found in ancient Egyptian history. Even if you claim that, such story was so devastating for the Egyptians that they tucked it under the rug, that would be extremely unlikely. That if that, event happened, it would still be mentioned. Surely you can expect distortion, portraying Moses as an evil, great and powerful wizard, for example, but you won't expect no mention of it whatsoever. So while Egyptians avoided self-criticism, major disruptions like economic collapse, loss of firstborns, destruction of the army, demographic shock, all of that would almost certainly leave indirect traces. Like you would find such evidence in administrative texts, in archaeology, in you would find demographic shifts, but we don't find such traces at the scale described in the Bible. And evolutionary psychology provides claims such as, morality is more efficiently explained through evolution than from rules given to us from God, or that, religious belief has no truth value, but it is also a belief that we developed for evolutionary purposes. In other words, it doesn't just take away, the belief that there can be, objective morality, which, by the way, it doesn't, but Christians often take it to mean that. But it also takes away the belief that morality comes and can only come from God, which it kind of does. Evolutionary psychology takes away the belief that morality comes with God, but doesn't necessarily take away that there is objective morality. So that's another debate, but for Christians, evolutionary psychology claims that there is no objective morality, since for them, objective morality can only come from God. Given these claims, it would seem obvious that this is not superficial but deep conflict. However, these challenges aren't really a problem for Plantinga because all they do is provide a superficial conflict, meaning that they don't provide the features for Christian belief. Or to say it differently, they provide no evidence to reduce the probability of theism. All challenges that arise from science are theories produced by science that are incompatible with Christian belief. He calls such science Simonian science. And so this term will pop up in the next page, and Oppy doesn't really explain it, so we better get it out of the way now. So Simonian science, in Plantinga's terms, is, science that produces theories incompatible with Christian belief. That would be, all of science, but Plantinga focuses on evolutionary psychology. And he writes that Simonian science can have either a weak or a strong methodological naturalism as its evidence base. So what does the term Simonian mean? Well, it's from Herbert Simon. He was an American polymath who died in 2001, and he worked in computer science, economics, cognitive science, artificial intelligence, political science, and evolutionary psychology. Plantinga says that his focus on Simon comes from an essay that he wrote titled A Mechanism for Social Selection and Successful Altruism, in which Simon wants to explain altruistic behavior from an evolutionary perspective. So, altruistic behavior is, in Plantinga's words, behavior that promotes the fitness of someone else at the expense of the altruist's own fitness, which should be at odds with what evolutionary theory, with what evolution by natural selection tells us. Simon explains it through two mechanisms: docility and bounded rationality. If we behave, altruistically, that's because we are unable to distinguish socially prescribed behavior that contributes to fitness from altruistic behavior. This is, called bounded rationality. This means that people who do altruistic acts, they think that if they don't perform that act, they will lose in fitness. In other words, it's because of self-interest that we act morally, and also because we are docile to our society. This clearly clashes with what Christians put in their evidence base. So we have new evidence that shows up, and it is in conflict with our previous beliefs, to which we assign high probability. So what do we do in this situation? Do we accept that the reason why we act altruistically is because of this docility and bounded rationality, which is incompatible with theist views of morality and altruism? If yes, then the conclusions endorsed by Simonian science are the features to your Christian belief. But this incompatibility is only superficial, whether those theories come from an evidence base of weak or strong methodological naturalism, according to Plantinga. Strong methodological naturalism, for a reminder, asserts in its evidence base the claim that there is no God. So it starts with assigning high prior probabilities to the denials of central Christian beliefs. Theories that then come out of strong methodological naturalism are theories that also give high probability that central Christian beliefs are false. But for Plantinga, starting with high prior probability that a certain belief is false is one thing, providing it a feature to that belief is another. Theories that rise out of strong methodological naturalism fail to deliver those features. Those sciences can hardly provide the features for Christian belief. And here's Oppy quoting Plantinga. The relevant point is that the evidence base of the inquiry in question includes the denial of central Christian beliefs. If so, however, the fact that this inquiry comes to conclusions incompatible with Christian belief would be neither surprising nor, for Christians, an occasion for consternation or dismay. It would certainly not constitute a feature for Christian belief. And the same will, of course, hold for weak methodological naturalism. If science produces theories that assign no prior probabilities to central Christian beliefs and are incompatible with Christian beliefs, there too, they do not provide the Christian theist with a defeater for Christian beliefs that are incompatible with that science. The evidence base for Simonian science, given weak methodological naturalism, is part of the Christian's evidence base, but only part of it. Hence, the fact that Simonian science comes to conclusions incompatible with Christian belief doesn't provide the believer with a defeater for her belief. So this is Plantinga's main objection, that the scientific conclusions incompatible with Christian beliefs, they don't provide defeaters to Christian beliefs. So even if these conflicts are real, again, Plantinga doesn't deny that there are indeed conflicts. He contends that these conflicts are just superficial conflicts because they provide no defeaters. But this is where things get weird, because Plantinga isn't that clear. His only point seems that because we don't have the features from Simonian science, then the conflict between theism and science is only superficial. But is it though? Oppy gives a few quotes from Plantinga to highlight this lack of clarity. Though real, these conflicts are superficial because they don't tend to provide the features for Christian or theistic belief. Their theories don't automatically, at any rate, constitute or provide a defeater for the Christian beliefs with which they conflict. The fact that scientists come up with views like Wilson's does not, just as such, offer a defeater for Christian belief. So Wilson here is David Sloan Wilson, an American evolutionary biologist, who argues that the mechanisms that produce religious beliefs in us, they don't aim at producing true beliefs, but rather beliefs that, conduce to some other end, like, securing the benefits of cooperation. So it's another Simonian scientific claim at odds with the Christian beliefs about incarnation, resurrection, God's intervening in the physical world, etc. So moving on. So we continue. The fact that competent work from the scientific perspective comes up with claims inconsistent with Christian belief isn't, just as such anyway, a defeater for those beliefs. Simonian science doesn't, automatically anyway, constitute a defeater for the Christian beliefs with which it is incompatible. The mere existence of Simonian science has no tendency to produce a defeater for those tenets. Of course, it is theoretically possible that a defeater for Christian belief should arise in the course of work at Simonian science. As far as I know, however, this hasn't happened. The conclusion to draw is that there is indeed conflict between science and Christian belief in this area, but the conflict is merely superficial, of no deep significance. So notice that Plantinga keeps restating the same thing. Because Simonian science gives no defeaters, there is no deep conflict between theism and science. However, is this true? I mean, yes, if Simonian science doesn't give any defeaters to Christian belief, then yes, you can argue that there is only superficial conflict between theism and science. But what does support Plantinga's assertion that Simonian science doesn't offer any defeaters? Well, for Plantinga, it's just the mere existence of sciences characterized by methodological naturalism, or the mere fact that there are such sciences that come to conclusions incompatible with Christian belief. In other words, Plantinga says that the mere fact of Simonian science existing, or the mere fact that there are scientists whose evidence base either contains that God doesn't exist or doesn't contain that God exists, isn't sufficient to provide the features to Christian beliefs. In short, sciences characterized by methodological naturalism don't automatically or as such constitute the features for Christian belief. And Plantinga is right. Just because scientists committed to methodological naturalism don't have in their evidence base that God exists or have that God doesn't exist, it doesn't mean that, God doesn't really or actually exist. So just because Simonian science exists doesn't mean that Christian beliefs are defeated. This is what Plantinga's argument boils down to. His objection to naturalism is that it takes naturalism as just saying, since Simonian science exists, therefore God doesn't exist or Christian beliefs are defeated. If that indeed was the naturalist argument, then yes, that argument is fallacious, since from the mere existence of Simonian science, you cannot logically conclude that Christian beliefs are false. So Plantinga would be right. However, that's not what naturalism claims. It doesn't say, I provide the features to Christian beliefs just by the mere existence of methodological naturalism. Naturalism actually provides the features for other reasons than just Simonian science exists. Or at least, let's say as Oppy does, just because Plantinga says that the mere existence of Simonian science doesn't lead to the features to Christian belief, it doesn't mean that the sciences themselves, when you look at them, when you look at their details, when you look at their claims, their methodology, their theoretical virtues, etc., it doesn't mean that the sciences themselves, they don't provide the features. Naturalism basically says that Simonian physics or evolutionary biology, for example, they provide the features for good reasons, not because they just exist. No. So to quote Oppy, but it hardly follows from these observations that no such sciences provide the features for Christian belief. And Plantinga's assurance that as far as he knows, there is no independent reason to suppose that the features for Christian belief have arisen in the course of work in such sciences does nothing to strengthen the case. So what you need to do is argue why such sciences don't provide the features for your Christian beliefs. Why is it that evolutionary psychology and historical biblical criticism don't provide the features? But if you look at the details of those sciences, instead of just their mere existence, you'll be more likely to provide the features. So when we look at the data that those sciences have unearthed, the comparative power of the explanations provided by those sciences, the predictive accuracy of those sciences, the comparative simplicity of the theoretical postulates of those sciences, the comparative parsimony of the ontology and ideology of those sciences, the comparative goodness of fit of those sciences with other well-established sciences and background knowledge and so forth. So it would be entirely reasonable to suggest evolutionary psychology and higher biblical criticism provide the features for Christian belief. For Oppy, if a claim has more theoretical virtues than another, then it is sufficient for it to be a defeater. If the belief that Q is more theoretically virtuous than the belief that P, then Q is a defeater of P. Now, this aspect of a defeater isn't overlooked by Plantinga's epistemology. He knows that the criteria of being more theoretically virtuous can be a defeater, and so he'll try to argue that theism is more theoretically virtuous than naturalism, and we will see why that's wrong. But for now, we are discussing the claim that the conflict between science and theism is superficial because Simonian science doesn't provide the features to theism. Our objection is that Plantinga's argument rests on a straw man. He claims that the naturalist point of view argues that it is by virtue of existing, of merely existing, that science provides the features to theism. What Oppy says, however, is that the naturalist claim is it's because of those sciences, because those sciences are more theoretically virtuous than theism, that they are the features, or at any rate significant contributors to the features for Christian belief, and not by the mere virtue of their existence. So when Plantinga argues that theism is more virtuous than naturalism will be discussed in the 7th section. For now, we can conclude that Plantinga doesn't succeed in providing that the conflict between Simonian science, evolutionary psychology and higher biblical criticism, and theism is only merely superficial. It is nonetheless true that Simonian science doesn't provide the features for Christian beliefs. The considerations that he advances in where the conflict really lies are insufficient, however, to establish that this is so. So this takes us to the second claim of Plantinga, that there is only merely apparent conflict. We've seen that the claim that there is merely superficial conflict is wrong, but what about merely apparent conflict? So, merely apparent conflict, contrary to superficial conflict, is illusory conflict. If a conflict is superficial, it's not an illusion. The conflict is real, but it's not a threat to the Christian belief. Apparent conflict is not conflict at all. For example, in Plantinga's view of superficial conflict, that the historical record conflicts with biblical narratives is indeed a conflict, but we can still believe in the Bible despite that conflict. You can still believe in the moral beliefs of Christianity despite evolutionary psychology. Neither historical accounts nor evolutionary psychology give you the features for Christian beliefs. So while they conflict, the conflict isn't that deep to the point where you have to either accept the historical record or your Christian belief. So you can actually, believe in both. In apparent conflict, however, there is no conflict whatsoever. Oppy here mentions evolutionary theory or evolutionary biology and the natural sciences like physics, chemistry, biology, etc. According to Plantinga, these are entirely compatible with theism, even if at first hand they seem inconsistent. On the one hand, while theism is consistent with the claim that natural selection is unguided, mindless, blind, ultimately mechanical, the claim that natural selection is unguided is no part of evolutionary theory, but rather a metaphysical or theological addition. On the other hand, first, if we think about the universe in classical terms, then while the claim that there is divine action in the world is inconsistent with the claim that the universe is causally closed, the claim that the universe is causally closed is no part of classical science, but rather a metaphysical or theological addition. And two, if we think about the universe from the standpoint of quantum mechanics, there is currently nothing that rules out the view that God causes all collapse outcomes. So this is Plantinga's objection. Naturalism claims that evolution and the natural sciences are inconsistent with theism. With regards to evolution, naturalists, they claim that evolution and theism are inconsistent because evolution by natural selection is unguided. There is no one behind evolution deciding what the biological world would look like in advance. Plantinga, however, says that this characterization of natural selection as unguided is unscientific because science doesn't say that natural selection is indeed unguided, mindless, blind, or purely mechanical. It's rather an addition to science, a metaphysical or theological addition. If we take science as just as it is, what it actually says, then we won't find this adjective of unguided regarding evolution. So given that science proper doesn't have this unguided adjective to evolution, there is no reason to suggest that evolution and theism are inconsistent. As for natural sciences, here Plantinga is referring to physics, both classical and quantum physics. Classical physics is Newtonian physics, and there is an assumption that Newtonian physics are inconsistent with Christian belief because Christian belief argue that God intervenes in the physical world, whereas classical physics would argue that he doesn't. In Newtonian physics, there is no room for divine intervention. But why? I mean, Newton was a Christian and he explicitly believes in God and explicitly writes in his Principia Mathematica that God is directing and presiding over all the world, which he creates ex nihilo, and from whom the natural laws are flowing like water flows out of a fountain. Newton is also a proponent of the fine-tuning argument, which states that given how neatly the universe is organized, how beautiful the system of the sun, planets, and comets is, how finely tuned all of this is, it can only have originated from the proceedings of the counsel and dominion of an intelligent and powerful being. So, why would people believe that Newton's physics are inconsistent with theism? Well, that's because his physics came to be understood as deeply deterministic. Physics don't need the intervention of God, at least, once created. They work perfectly on their own, like a machine that doesn't need an external hand to turn it on at least more than once. This also means that such a machine can run on forever once we turn it on. The universe would be like that, some sort of machine that can go on forever since it doesn't require the intervention of something from the outside. So on this interpretation, once God creates the universe and establishes its initial conditions and laws, the subsequent history of the universe unfolds deterministically. Each state of the world follows necessarily from the previous one, leaving, no causal gaps within the physical order. And so this means that we had complete knowledge of all the natural laws. If we had knowledge of all the natural laws, would be able to predict the future without ever once needing God's intervention to explain anything. And if, of course, such intervention occurs, it would be a violation of those same laws. Take conservation laws, also known as the principle of conservation of energy. When no external force acts on a system, the total momentum of the system remains constant in magnitude and direction. In other words, the internal energy of a system remains constant. Divine intervention would violate this principle, making the energy in the cosmos not constant. If a velocity or direction of a particle is changed through God's intervention instead of just the internal laws of the system that we can predict, then it means a change in energy has occurred. If if he can do this, then the energy would not be conserved in the system, making them then things that were not supposed to happen according to natural laws happen, like the parting of the Red Sea, for example, or changing water into wine, or bringing someone back to life, or as Plantinga says, creating ex nihilo a full-grown horse in the middle of Times Square. So these feats would be impossible unless you violate the conservation of energy principle, which states that energy must always be constant in a universe. But this is where Plantinga's objection comes in. A deterministic universe with constant energy, meaning the cosmos is like a machine that runs forever once we turn it on, like some sort of machine that can go on forever, that never runs out of energy. It has to be causally closed or an isolated system. So this doesn't mean that the flow of energy is infinite, but that energy is never lost, that it is constant and therefore always conserved. That's always there in the universe, always circulating within the cosmos. In other words, the energy never goes away, it never escapes the universe, it never leaves the machine. So we can say that the universe is causally closed. Natural laws then describe how the world works when or provided that the world is closed, is a closed, isolated system subject to no outside causal influence. So in this sense, Newtonian physics, they appear to leave no room for divine intervention within nature because the physical system is thought to be explanatory, self-sufficient. So we can say that the universe is causally closed. Once it is set into motion, all of causal events, they happen within that system. However, while it is true that Newtonian physics would be inconsistent with divine intervention in a causally closed system, there is no way we can assert that our universe is indeed a causally closed causally closed universe. The Newtonian picture actually has room for God acting in the world, unlike post-Newtonian pictures that reinterpreted Newton's physics and added that our universe is a causally closed universe. So that view associated with Laplace, for example, but in reality, classical physics or classical mechanics are compatible with that picture that God intervenes in the physical world and also that human beings act freely in the world. Given that nothing in science can compel us to accept that the universe is causally closed, it becomes entirely possible for God to create a full-grown horse in the middle of Times Square without violating the principle of conservation of energy. So theism and science would be inconsistent if indeed the universe was closed causally, but nothing in the universe, in the laws of nature, states that the universe is closed or that for God to intervene he has to fuck up some laws. So according to Plantinga, it is not part of Newtonian mechanics or Newtonian classical science generally to declare that the material universe is a closed system, because that claim isn't physics but a theological or metaphysical add-on. And of course, the same holds true for quantum physics. It doesn't rule out God's intervention in collapse outcomes. Quantum collapses, again, this is explained from a non-expert in physics. So here's what I know from my very humble knowledge of quantum physics. In quantum physics, correct me if I'm wrong in the comments, collapse approaches are ways of explaining what happens when a quantum system is measured. Normally, a system can exist in a superposition of multiple possible states at once. So this is illustrated by Schrodinger's famous cat thought experiment. Imagine a cat in a sealed box, along with a device that has 50% chance of releasing poison. According to quantum theory, before the box is opened, the system is not merely one where we don't know whether the cat is alive or dead. Rather, the quantum state represents a superposition of both possibilities. Quantum physics says that before measurement, both outcomes are present in the quantum state. But when we open the box, when we perform a measurement, we always observe one definitive outcome. The cat is either alive or dead. So this is also called the collapse of the wave function. The problem is that the standard quantum equations describe smooth deterministic evolution between measurements and do not explain how or why a single outcome appears when a measurement occurs. Collapse approaches say that something real happens at measurement. The quantum state collapses from multiple possibilities into one actual result. So some collapse views treat this collapse as part of the measurement process itself without specifying a physical mechanism. So this is the traditional Copenhagen idea. Others, they are called objective collapse theories. They claim that collapse is a genuine physical process governed by new stochastic laws occurring spontaneously and especially rapidly in large or complex systems. On this view, microscopic systems, they can remain in superposition, but microscopic objects quickly collapse into definite states, which explains why we never observe objects in multiple places at once. What all collapse approaches share is the idea that only one outcome actually occurs and that this outcome is genuinely random. Because of that collapse happening randomly, some theists, they have argued that quantum collapse would be an instance of divine intervention. Quantum mechanics so leaves measurement outcomes indeterminate until the wave function collapses. So some theists, they see this indeterminacy as an opening for God to act within the universe and without violating natural laws. In other words, God could determine which outcome actually occurs at the moment of the collapse, making the collapse itself a form of divine intervention. God could act through quantum events in a way that is non-deterministic and compatible with physical laws. So, what does Oppy think of Plantinga's objection? Well, he agrees. He grants, and without argument, that it is consistent with the relevant science to suppose that God guides natural selection, causes collapse outcomes, and causally intervenes in the workings of the universe. So he agrees just for the sake of argument, or he makes, these concessions because he doesn't want to argue, because for Oppy, this objection kind of misses the problem in the first place. Plantinga argues that because theism is consistent with science, then science defeats naturalism. But first, anything can be consistent with science depending on your imagination. Core claims of all religions are consistent with science. I can make up some bullshit belief that doesn't contradict science. It doesn't make that belief true or defeat those who claim contrary beliefs. Just because my beliefs are consistent with science, it doesn't mean that yours are inconsistent with science. So the question whether there is conflict between theism and evolutionary theory and between theism and natural science concerning divine action in the world is still not settled. Conflict isn't resolved because there is consistency. And secondly, if you claim that science defeats naturalism because naturalism makes, quote, metaphysical or theological addition to suppose that natural selection is unguided and that the universe is causally closed and that collapse outcomes are entirely chancy. It is also metaphysical or theological addition to suppose that God guides natural selection and intervenes in the workings of the universe and causes collapse outcomes. So even if the adjective unguided is, added, and that the universe is closed and collapse outcomes are random, are just add-ups, the same is true for the claim that God guides natural selection, or that he intervenes in the natural universe, or that he causes collapse outcomes. So if naturalism is inconsistent with science because of those add-ups, then theism should also be inconsistent with science. And not just that, but if we go further and compare the two kinds of additions, those of naturalism and those of theism, we find that they are different in their ontological commitments in terms of costs. We can say that the naturalistic add-ups have a smaller ontological or ideological cost than the theistic add-ups, if not none. So an ontological or ideological cost is when your ontological or ideological commitment forces you into adding on entities and attitudes that are unnecessary for understanding a shared, agreed upon reality. For example, to say that natural selection is unguided is a claim that doesn't, require believing in something more than the process of natural selection itself. The ontological realm is, to which, you commit, is the same as the ontological realm in which natural selection occurs. However, when you say that natural selection is guided and guided by God, then you are committed to another ontological realm in addition to the ontological realm in which natural reality or natural selection occurs. So the metalogical or theological addition of a theist has a greater cost since it has to commit to two different ontological realms, whereas the metalogical or theological addition of a naturalist occur within one and the same realm. And both additions produce the same understanding of the realm of natural selection in terms of science. Everything that the naturalist and the theist say about natural selection itself is identical in terms of data quantity and the theory. The only difference is in their metaphysical and theological additions. But the additions of the theists, they only add to more demands and requirements for him to explain, but don't add any substantial or significant information to how natural selection works. So it's an unnecessary cost. We won't learn more about natural selection by adding that it is guided by God. So the only thing that the theist succeeds in doing is adding burdens of proof to himself, since now he also has to explain how God guides natural selection, or how he intervenes in the world, or how he causes collapse, and that is supposed to help us understand better, these phenomenon, to better understand natural selection, the collapse of the wave function, etc. So just stating that God is doing it doesn't add any significant information to how the universe works or why the wave function collapses. So to quote Oppy, moreover, while the naturalistic, metaphysical, or theological additions bring no ontological or ideological costs, the same is manifestly not true for the theistic, metaphysical, or theological additions. Christian belief involves a host of ontological and ideological commitments that naturalism does not incur, unless those additional commitments are suitably repaid through better fit with data, or greater explanatory power, or greater predictive accuracy, or better fit with other established science and background knowledge, or the like. It will still be true that the claims that God guides natural selection and intervenes in the working of the universe and causes collapse outcomes are genuinely gratuitous from the standpoint of evolutionary theory, physics, and the rest of the sciences. So the difference is that naturalistic additions are not gratuitous, unlike theistic additions. However, that being said, the central claim of this section is about a deep conflict between theism and science. Naturalism claims that there is a deep conflict between theism and science, while theists, they claim that there is no such conflict and that it is only merely apparent. Everything we said so far doesn't really settle that issue. So is the conflict between evolutionary theory and natural science and theism, deep or, merely apparent? We just show that just because they are consistent between, there is consistency between theism and science, it doesn't mean that there is no conflict, and that if we are going to make the conflict about adapts, then theism has adapts too, and perhaps more adapts. That naturalism's adapts have smaller cost, however, is not relevant. Regarding the issue about deep or merely apparent conflict. That theism makes ontologically and ideologically committing claims about evolution and divine intervention, and that those claims are mere metaphysical and theological additions from the standpoints of all the sciences, both the natural and the human sciences, that still doesn't prove or disprove that there is conflict. So the question remains, is there conflict, yes or no? So clearly, what we have shown so far doesn't answer the question. As Oppy says, even if evolutionary theory and the rest of the natural and human sciences have no need for the hypothesis that God guides natural selection, that God intervenes in the workings of the universe, and that God causes collapse outcomes, how does that suffice to show that there is conflict between these theistic claims and those sciences? Well, it doesn't unless you ask the question, what about probability? Does the fact that theistic adapts give a bigger cost makes them less probable from the standpoint of evolutionary theory and the rest of the natural and human sciences, and hence asserting that there is conflict? So does being gratuitous have any impact on the prior probabilities that science assigns to these superfluous hypotheses? And from there, can we say that there is conflict between theism and science? Well, yes. First, the fact that theistic superfluous hypotheses, the adapts, are more costly, given that they commit to ontological realms other than the realm of natural sciences, makes it obvious that evolutionary theory and the rest of the natural and human sciences do not assign high prior probability to these hypotheses. So this means that science will either assign low probability to these hypotheses or no probability at all. And if you paid attention and remember what we said in the section on the background by Plantinga's own lights, attributing low or no probability to theistic hypotheses makes those sciences characterized by weak methodological naturalism. But Plantinga himself said that sciences characterized by weak methodological naturalism don't provide the features for theism. We've seen that it's not the case with evolutionary psychology and higher biblical criticism. Just because you attribute low or no probability to a hypothesis, doesn't mean that you provide no the features for that hypothesis. You certainly don't provide any by the simple fact of attributing those probabilities, but you do for the reasons you have to attribute such low probabilities. The details of those sciences, like the data they have on Earth, their productive accuracy, their comparative power of explanation, their simplicity, the theoretical virtues, etc. We've seen, them in the section on superficial conflict. So it is for these reasons that we assign such probabilities to those theistic hypotheses. And it is because those probabilities are either so low or inexistent, which doesn't mean that they have zero, but that they are just, they are so low that we just don't bother with it. Makes the case for a deep conflict and not, just a superficial one. We can say that Simonian science provides the features for Christian belief. And so here Oppy argues, still using Plantinga's standards, nothing prevents us from doing the same to evolutionary theory and the rest of the sciences. We can extend the treatment that Plantinga makes of evolutionary psychology and higher biblical criticism to the rest of the sciences. If Plantinga's argument is that assigning low or no probability to Christian belief makes Simonian science, meaning that it is characterized by weak methodological naturalism, but that doesn't provide the features for those beliefs, but we show that it is false and that Simonian science does provide the features, then the same also holds for the rest of the sciences, which is also, Simonian science too, right? Likewise, given that evolutionary theory and the rest of the natural and human sciences assign low probability to Christian beliefs, they are also Simonian science, but they have good reasons to do so, like their commitment cost. Then we can say, that there is a real conflict and not just superficial conflict either. So, to conclude this section, we can say, but since Plantinga does not establish that there is merely superficial conflict between theism and evolutionary psychology and between theism and higher biblical criticism, it is then clear that Plantinga also does not establish that there is merely superficial conflict between theism and evolutionary theory and between theism and the rest of the natural and human sciences. For all that, Plantinga argues in the first two parts of where the conflict really lies, it may be that the natural and human sciences do provide the features for Christian belief. But Plantinga is still not defeated, even if he fails to establish that the conflict between theism and science is merely apparent or superficial. Even if we reject those two claims, there is still the third claim that there is deep concord between science and theism. So the next three sections will be about the third claim, starting with the arguments for theism. And here too, the notion of probability will play a role. See, I think that we didn't really give enough evidence for the claim that science assigning low probability to Christian beliefs is out of good reasons, because what if science has also good reasons to assign high probability to Christian beliefs? So this is what will be the focus of the fifth section. The arguments for theism are arguments that will try to assign a high probability to Christian beliefs from the standards of science. So let's see if it is the case. Plantinga gives two arguments for the claims for this third claim. So these arguments, he claims, offer slight support in favor of theism. So this argument should get us to the conclusion that atheism is wrong, or more precisely that atheism is less likely than theism, and therefore theism is supposed to be preferable to atheism. So the first argument is called the famous fine-tuning argument, and the second argument is called the protein machine argument. So here they are. Premise 1, fine-tuning is not at all surprising or impossible on theism. Premise 2, fine-tuning is exceedingly improbable on the atheistic hypothesis that according to which the constants have their values by chance. 3, conclusion, therefore theism is to be preferable to atheism. And for the protein machines, he says, premise 4, protein machines are not all surprising or impossible on theism. Protein machines, premise 2, protein machines are exceedingly improbable on the atheistic hypothesis of unguided evolution. Therefore, theism is to be preferred to atheism. So in simple terms, if fine-tuning exists, then theism is more probable than atheism because theism is compatible with fine-tuning, it can account for it, while atheism can provide no good explanation for fine-tuning. Since fine-tuning exists, then theism is preferable to atheism. And the same goes for protein machines. They exist, therefore theism is to be preferred to atheism. So it is a comparative argument which attempts to explain that theism is more probable than atheism. But there are two difficulties with these arguments. The first difficulty, which both Oppy and Plantinga actually agree on, is that we don't have good ways to evaluate the conditional probability of F, meaning fine-tuning, giving theism, T, and the probability of fine-tuning giving atheism, the probability of protein machine giving fine-tuning, and the probability of protein machines giving atheism, that figure in their premises. Okay, so that's the Bayesian theorem, which calculates the probability of the fine-tuning giving theism and atheism, and likewise the probability of the protein machines giving theism and atheism. So if you start with a theistic big picture, would fine-tuning be more probable than when you start from an atheistic one? If fine-tuning is more probable from theism than on theism than atheism, and given that fine-tuning exists, then theism is more aligned with science than atheism or naturalism. When you run the equation, the closer the posterior probability is to 1, the more strongly the evidence supports the hypothesis. So the closer it is to 0, the less it does. The problem is it is extremely hard and unreliable to make such calculations, and here both Oppy and Plantinga agree. But the second difficulty where they don't agree is that for Plantinga, the two arguments are valid, whereas for Oppy, these arguments are plainly invalid, which makes them kind of useless. So let's start with the fine-tuning argument. So the argument basically compares what theism and naturalism say about the fine-tuning. But to do such a comparison, we need to sketch some of the details of these two kinds of big pictures at the level of detail, at the same level of detail. That is, we don't leave details unfilled in one view that are filled in on the other view. So we have to be fair to both views and develop all the details that are relevant in both big pictures. So let's start with theism as defined by Plantinga. So according to theism, Plantinga's version, that is, God creates universes if he wants to. If there is a universe, there has to be a creator of that universe. It's impossible for a universe to exist without a creator. Now, normally this would be begging the question, since the world that the world has a creator is precisely what theists need to prove. But we will allow this since Plantinga's move is you start with theism and see if fine-tuning makes more sense on theism than atheism. And if it does, then theism beats atheism. Like the probability of fine-tuning on the proposition that God has created the universe is, according to Plantinga, much greater than on the proposition that the universe has not been created. And consequently, the probability of God's having created the universe is greater on fine-tuning. So according to Plantinga, every possible word contains God. In some possible words, God does not create. In other possible words, God does create. In many possible words, God creates one or more universes. So here there is a distinction between word and universes. There are words that are just empty, where God didn't create any universe. So word is wider than universe. Think of it as where God creates universes. So this is how he starts. There are many worlds and God has access to all of them. And this is not, each word has its own God. It's rather the same God, the one of the Christian faith, that has access to all worlds. There are no worlds in which God cannot create. Some he leaves empty, while in others he creates one or more universes. Okay, so the fact that in some words there are universes while others are left empty is absolutely and completely up to God's own free will. Quote, the ensembles of universes that God creates depend upon God's creative intentions. Since there are many different ensembles of universes that God might have created, there are many different creative intentions that God might have had. Moreover, God's creative intentions are fundamental. There is nothing in any possible world that causes God to have the creative intentions that God has in that possible world, and there is nothing in any possible world that explains why God has the particular creative intentions that God has in that possible world, rather than other creative intentions that God has in other possible worlds. Furthermore, any possible universe exists in at least one possible world in which God creates that universe, and hence in which God has creative intentions appropriate to the creation of that universe. So this is the theistic big picture. It doesn't matter, for our purposes here, if God also creates the world in which he can create universes. What matters is that he has intentions of creating. So nothing compels him or causes him to create except, his own intention to do so. Therefore, we can never explain why God had the intentions he had to create or not to create. So everything that exists must have been created out of the creative intention of God. Everything in the universe is, everything, including the universe, is created because it was willed. So everything created is created because it was willed, it was created on purpose, and this is perhaps the only thing that all versions of naturalism reject, that a universe was intentionally created and that its cause is a non-natural entity. But the claim that there are multiple worlds and universes can be claimed by some versions of naturalism. If you remove the non-natural element in Plantinga's big picture, you will have a big picture that simply says there are many possible worlds that are ensembles of universes. Perhaps all possible worlds are ensembles of universes, or perhaps there are possible worlds that are empty. Moreover, any possible universe exists in at least one possible world. So that's a version of naturalism that matches Plantinga's theism minus the whole God thing. Now, from this, we get to the fine-tuning. Giving this account that everything is created because God had the intention of creating, then if our universe is fine-tuned, it would doubtless be true that our universe is fine-tuned because God intended it to be fine-tuned. And it would also be true that the fine-tuned values are as they are because God intended that they should be as they are. So fine-tuned values are the values of the parameters or the physical constants of the universe. So let me explain. According to Plantinga, there's a life-permitting range, meaning that in order to have life in the universe, you need specific conditions. So you have a range of conditions that make it possible for life to exist. However, when we look at what it takes for those conditions to come together, it seems that the probability of them actually coming together on their own is very slim. In other words, we can say that several of the basic physical constants of the universe must fall within very narrow limits if intelligent life of our kind is to develop. So those constants are things like, the velocity of light, the strength of the gravitational force, and of the strong and weak nuclear forces. For example, if the strength of gravity were even slightly stronger, all stars would be blue giants, and if slightly weaker, all would be red dwarfs, which won't allow in either case for life to have developed. So the same goes for the weak and strong nuclear forces. If either had been even slightly different, life, at any rate, even remotely similar to the sort that we have, could probably not have developed. So for those constants to come together within the life-permitting range, given the odds, that would be almost impossible. But when they do, we say that their value, the value of a parameter or a constant, like the value, of the strength of gravity, falls within that life-permitting range. So given that the life-permitting range is small compared to the total range within which that parameter could fall, that the range, in which gravity must fall compared to all other ranges in which it could fall, but in which life would be impossible, is incredibly small. Like the chances for gravity to fall within that small, limited, narrow range is close to nothing. But when it does fall there, we say that its value is fine-tuned. When it falls outside that range, its value isn't fine-tuned. Now, a little bit of technicality. If you say that it falls within the range, it means that you have two-sided fine-tuning. Like, to know what's a range, you must, know the two sides of the range. But if you know only one side, you have a one-sided fine-tuning, and then you would say that the value of a parameter falls closer to that one edge. But that doesn't really matter. All of this is just to say that giving the odds for the value of a parameter to fall close to the edge or within the life-permitting range, this is better explained by an intervention, by something who was looking at how the constants were behaving. They were never falling into that specific, necessary range for life. So something had to step in and force them into falling into that range, thereby fine-tuning their values as well. So a value is fine-tuned when it falls within the range that permits life, the life-permitting range. But if it is fine-tuned, then it must be tuned for an intention. Thus, theism offers a better explanation for fine-tuning, which is taken as a fact, than atheism. In short, fine-tuning is not at all surprising or improbable on theism. God presumably would want there to be life, and indeed intelligent life with whom to communicate and share love. Of course, this life could take many different forms. Indeed, perhaps it has taken many forms, but it doesn't seem at all improbable that God would want to create life, both human life and life of other sorts. And if he wanted to create human life in a universe at all like ours, he would have been obliged to fine-tune the constants. On the other hand, on the atheistic hypothesis, according to which these constants have their values by chance, that is, those values are not the result of anyone's choice or intention, it is exceedingly improbable that they would be fine-tuned for life. But here's the problem with this argument. This argument basically says that the fine-tuning of values is what it is because God intended it to be so, right? So fine-tuning exists, and if it exists without an intention, without an intentional intervention, let's say, that would be surprising as fuck given the odds. But if you say that it was God's intention that the fine-tuned values should be as they are, then it won't be surprising that the fine-tuned values are the way they are, right? But here's the difficulty of the argument. If its success lies in the fact that it manages to give a non-surprising account for fine-tuned values, and by that gives it a high probability, since the existence of something with high probability to exist won't surprise us, like, the point of the argument is to get rid of that surprising element, well, it actually fails to get rid of it. It fails because it just pushes a little bit further down the line, that surprising element. Instead of asking, is it surprising that there was no intention to make a universe in which, the fine-tuned values are as they are, we now ask, is it surprising that God had the intention to make a universe in which the fine-tuned values are as they are? So in both cases, the answer will be yes, it is surprising. In the case of atheism, it is surprising because of the odds that the value of the parameters falls by themselves into the life-permitting range. In the case of theism, it is surprising because the odds that God would have the intention to make those values fall in that range. If all universes were made by God and nothing is done without his intention in creation, then all the universe that are not tuned, in which the fine-tuned values differ from their actual values, were also intentionally made so by God. So, God may have intended for our universe to have values of parameters fit into the range of life, but then it means that he also intended for the other universes to have the values of their parameters not fall into that life range, meaning that he intended that the other universes don't have life in them. Given that, universes with fine-tuned values are extremely rare, or that even within our own universe, life is extremely rare, and all universes are intentionally created in the way that they are, then we can say that the intentions of creating universes are extremely small. Creating universes that are finely tuned are extremely small. So they're as small as fine-tuning emerging from pure luck. If, Oppy says, if fine-tuned universes are rare in the possible ensembles of universes, then God's intending to create fine-tuned universes will be rare in the space of possible worlds. So, fine-tuning is still surprising, even with atheistic accounts, and thus its probability, the probability of fine-tuning on theism, given theism, will not be that different from its probability given atheism. So here, naturalism takes the advantage again, given that its commitment cost is lower. Both big pictures can agree that our universe is fine-tuned, but they don't have less or more reason than the other to be surprised that it is fine-tuned. So, in short, fine-tuning has the same probability whether with theism or atheism. The only difference is, again, the commitment cost. So, quote again from Oppy. So this is going to be a long quote. On naturalism, if our universe is fine-tuned, there is a question to be faced about why the fine-tuned values are as they are. However, it seems clear that naturalists have no more reason to be surprised by the fine-tuning of the universe than theists have reasons to be surprised that God had the intention to create a fine-tuned universe. After all, the extent to which on naturalism fine-tuned universes are rare in the total space of possible worlds is exactly matched by the extent to which on theism God's intention to create fine-tuned universes is rare in the total space of possible worlds. Hence, while the two views are exactly matched in terms of their ultimate commitments, naturalism actually does better than theism in terms of overall commitments. And the two views are exactly on a par in terms of their ability to provide an ultimate explanation of the fine-tuned values that we observe. The upshot here is that so long as we compare like with like, we do not see a relevant difference. On the one hand, the fine-tuning is no more and no less probable on theism than it is on naturalism. On the other hand, the fine-tuning is no more and no less probable on a hypothesis according to which it is a smaller chance that God intended to make a universe in which the fine-tuned values are as they actually are than it is on a hypothesis according to which it is a matter of chance that the fine-tuned values are as they actually are. So, now, there are at least two ways Plantinga can respond to this objection. The first response is to suggest that Oppy's objection mistakenly neglects the fact that God could have a preference for fine-tuned universes, meaning that God prefers fine-tuned universes over non-tuned ones. So, with this, you can argue that it is true that it is comparatively rare to find fine-tuned universes in the space of possible universe ensembles. When you look at the ensembles of possible universes, the non-tuned ones are more common compared to the tuned ones. That's true. But what is not true to find is not rare. Sorry, what is not rare to find is that God prefers fine-tuned universes. Since God has a preference for fine-tuned universes, even if their existence is rare comparatively and quantitatively speaking, meaning that there are very few fine-tuned universes, while there's a plethora of non-tuned universes or just empty universeless worlds. Even if it is the case, it wouldn't be surprising that at least our universe is fine-tuned. So God's having a preference for fine-tuned universes is not rare in the space of possible worlds, so it shouldn't be surprising that we live in a fine-tuned universe. And if this sounds, incoherent to you, well, that's because it is, because that reply is incoherent, as Oppy says. If God prefers fine-tuned universes, why would fine-tuned universes be so rare? If the preference is not rare in the space of possible worlds, then it means that in the worlds in which there are non-tuned universes, God intended for those universes to be non-tuned while preferring fine-tuned universes. Like in most cases of creation, his intentions don't reflect his preferences. And that's weird, that's incoherent, even with Plantinga's own view. Why and how would God have the intention to create a universe that he doesn't prefer? I mean, we're talking about God, right? What he prefers has to be unquestionably the best. Going for what he prefers less, and intentionally going for what he prefers less, means that he opted for an option that he knows isn't the best. He who prefers simplicity, beauty, elegance, intentionally created universes that do not reflect his preferences. Again, Plantinga clearly states that God's divine preference would be reflected in the world he has created, meaning that God's creative intentions are a perfect reflection of his preferences. So normally, everywhere we look, we must find an abundance of fine-tuned universes. His preferences and his intentions must always be each other's reflection. So it cannot be that he prefers fine-tuned universes everywhere, but he has the intention of creating fine-tuned universes in only a few ensembles, perhaps only one universe that is fine-tuned. So as Oppy says, so it cannot be that God's intending to create fine-tuned universes is rare in the space of possible of worlds, even though God's having a preference for fine-tuned universes is not rare in the space of possible worlds. So here's the contradiction. You cannot claim that God's preference for fine-tuned universes is common across possible universes, but God's intention to create fine-tuned universes is rare across possible universes or possible worlds. So Oppy also mentions another problem with this preference response, but he sets it aside. This other problem is if we introduce this notion of preference, that doesn't reflect intention, we'll also have to face complications raised by Plantinga's claim that God's creative activities are constrained by counterfactuals of creaturely freedom. So Oppy says that these complications are irrelevant because even if we consider them, they don't save the argument. But I will explain briefly what he means by that phrase if you want to look into it for yourself. So Plantinga's claim that God's creative activities are constrained by counterfactuals of creaturely freedom. So that view is called Molinism. So it's a 16th century theological system that tries to reconcile divine sovereignty with a human libertarian free will. It's named after Spanish Jesuit theologian Luis de Molina. So according to Molinism, God has middle knowledge of what any possible free creature would freely do in any possible circumstances. And so these truths are called counterfactuals of creaturely freedom. Example, if Alice were placed in circumstances C, she would freely choose A rather than B. So these counterfactuals are not under God's control, meaning that God cannot make a creature freely choose otherwise than what the true counterfactual says. So even though God is omnipotent, God's creative options are constrained by those counterfactuals. God cannot make Alice freely choose A rather than B in any circumstance other besides C. If Alice chooses A in circumstance D, then it wasn't out of free will, but because God made her choose A, and so God doesn't do that. So God can only actualize worlds where creatures act freely in accordance with the true counterfactuals, which means that some logically possible worlds are not feasible for God because people's free choices don't line up with God's intentions. So if you bring Molinism into fine-tuning, Plantinga would say something like, even if God prefers a fine-tuned universe, the only word God can create, are those compatible with the true counterfactuals of creaturely freedom. So God won't intend to create fine-tuning universes if it's going to violate free will. And Oppy says that we don't have to bother with all the complications this idea will raise. Let's ignore Plantinga's Molinism thesis about God being limited by counterfactuals of free creaturely choices because it's not relevant to the point Oppy is making here. It doesn't solve this conflict between intention and preferences. God would still prefer universes in which creatures choose freely, right? If God prefers to create us in His image, which is an essential doctrine in theism, the Imago Dei doctrine, the fact that there aren't many fine-tuned universes means that in most cases, when God preferred universes with free will, He had the intention of creating universes without free will. And apparently fine-tuned universes are also universes in which free will exists. So again, it doesn't solve anything besides raising more questions to which there won't be any answer besides raising, even more questions. So let's move to the second response that Plantinga can make. So the second response that Plantinga can make to Oppy's objection is that it mistakenly supposes that theists and naturalists agree about the space of possible universes. So this means that according to Plantinga, theists and naturalists disagree about what universes are possible at all. A naturalist, for example, can think that many chaotic, short-lived, lifeless universes are possible, whereas a theist might deny that some of these are really possible given God's nature. So, because the model space is different, Oppy cannot simply compare how rare fine-tuning is across both big pictures, since they don't have the same, let's say, amount of possible universes. Theistic big pictures seem to have a more restrict space of possible universes. But if theism restricts the space of possible universes, then fine-tuned universes might not be that rare relative to the theistic space, whereas they are rare relative to the naturalistic space. If that were true, then fine-tuning could still favor theism. And so with this move, Plantinga can argue that the symmetry between theism and naturalism that Oppy identified in terms of probability in his objection no longer hold. So, that fine-tuned universes are rare in the naturalist total space of possible universes doesn't match that God's intention to create fine-tuned universes is as rare in the theist total space of possible worlds or universes. So that's the possible reply. Since theists and naturalists actually disagree about which universes are possible, there are no good grounds for supposing that the extent to which on naturalism fine-tuned universes are rare in the total space of possible worlds is exactly matched by the extent to which on theism God's intention to create fine-tuned universes is rare in the total space of possible worlds. So I hope my explanation made it clear, because the reply is condensed in that long and complicated sentence. Anyway, so does this reply work better than the previous one about preferences? Well, no. Even if it's correct that naturalists just don't have any standards for what is possible, the reply is still ineffective. First, on what grounds can Plantinga argue that God cannot create chaotic, short-lived, or lifeless universes? Clearly, such universes are possible, and if they are possible, then God can create them. In what way would that contradict the nature of God in Plantinga's argument? So, theists can easily accept that it's not contrary to God's nature that he is able to make universes that last only for a tiny fraction of a second, or that blow apart so quickly that they only ever consist of empty space. But since those universes are compatible with God's creative capabilities and his intentions, then there is no reason to argue that naturalists and theists that don't have the same space for possible universes. And therefore, the same challenges that fine-tuning can bring to atheists and naturalists are actually the same challenges that fine-tuning can bring to theists as well. So it is wrong to assume that fine-tuning is an argument in favor of theism over atheism. In reality, it poses the same challenges to both big pictures. So, if God can make such chaotic universes, then God can intend to make such universes. And so, if there is a fine-tuning problem for atheists that is raised by the fine-tuning values being as they actually are, then there will be a fine-tuning problem for theists raised by God's intending the fine-tuned values to be as they actually are. So, neither response make fine-tuning more probable on theism than on atheism. The symmetry still holds for both big pictures. We can then conclude Oppy's counter-argument for Plantinga's fine-tuning argument before going to the second argument about protein machines. And the conclusion is this. I conclude that Plantinga's fine-tuning argument is ineffective even against naturalists who accept that there are possible worlds in which the fine-tuned values have values other than the values they actually take. But before jumping into the protein machine argument, we have to say one last thing about the second reply. It says that naturalists and theists don't have the same space of possible universes, right? And it tried to justify that fine-tuning is more probable on theism than atheism and naturalism because of this difference in that space, right? So we've seen that it's not true, and that nothing prevents theists from believing that God can create worlds that are possible in the naturalist space, right? So we basically deny that there is such difference in the spaces. But what if we accept such difference, that there is a difference in the spaces, but in the reverse way? So far, it's argued that the space of theists is more restrictive than that of naturalists. We've seen that it's not the case, or there are no reasons to suppose that it is the case. But what if it was the other way around? What if naturalists have the most restrictive space? What if they actually don't believe that there are other possible universes with fine-tuned values besides our own? That is, they don't accept that there are possible worlds in which the fine-tuned values have values other than the values that they actually take. Like we don't reject, we as naturalists, we don't reject fine-tuning, we just say that there is only one way a world can be fine-tuned. There won't be anything here that contradicts naturalism, right? So we should be able to accept this view. If they accept that view, they may accept a more particular view, which is that the reason why our universe is fine-tuned, whereas the other possible worlds aren't, it's just the outworking of objective chance instead of intention. Like we really go hard and stuck all the odds against us. Only the fine-tuned universes, only one fine-tuned universe by pure chance. So of course, for this to even be relevant, all possible worlds must share the same natural laws and initial history, so that all physical constants are the same. Again, now the point of a fine-tuning argument is that you take the physical constants of our universe and apply them to different universes as well, to make the case that it's incredibly implausible that fine-tuning can occur with such constants. So, we adopt the following view. A view of metaphysical or ontological necessity, according to which all metaphysically or ontologically possible worlds share laws and initial history with the actual world and diverge from the actual world only as a result of the outworkings of objective chance. So, all possible worlds, including ours, they all come into existence with the same throwing of the dice, with the same laws and from the same starting point. And let's suppose we got one finely tuned universe and many others not tuned according to the same set of laws. So many others that diverge from the fine-tuned universe only out of chance. Now, there are two possible outcomes for our universe. Either the fine-tuned values take the values that they do at all points in the history of the actual world, or they acquire the values that they do at a certain point in history as a result of the outworkings of objective chance. So in other words, either it was from the start necessary for our universe to be fine-tuned, that from the beginning of our universe fine-tuning was occurring, we got the right combination from the first second of the universe, or fine-tuned came later at a certain point in our universe's history by objective chance. So both views are perfectly acceptable by naturalists. In the first view, they simply take those values as themselves metaphysically or ontologically necessary, so the universe could have been non-tuned and could have been non-tuned. And in the second view, well, it is explained in terms of the outworkings of objective chance at that time. So both present no problem to naturalists. So to all theists out there, stop throwing fine-tuning arguments at naturalists, because naturalists can consistently accept that the universe is finely tuned. It doesn't require a divine intention for explaining, fine-tuning, and even if our universe is the only one fine-tuned, we don't necessarily find it surprising. Now, let's move to the protein machine argument. We're not going to dwell on this one like we did with fine-tuning, because everything we said about fine-tuning actually just applies to the protein machine argument. So a protein machine argument is like the fine-tuning argument. It's a design argument, meaning an argument that claims the universe is intelligently designed, suggesting that something had the intention to design the universe as it is, and that something is God. So the protein machine makes the same claim, that the existence of highly complex coordinated protein-based molecular machines in living cells is best explained by intelligent design rather than unguided natural processes. The argument became popular with biochemist Michael Behe's 1996 book, Darwin's Black Box. So Darwin's Black Box. So Oppy will mention Behe in the next section, so we will come back to Behe. But for now, we will work with this version of the argument. So this is also known as the irreducible complexity argument, and it goes like this. Protein machines are irreducibly complex. They require many interacting parts to function at all. But irreducibly complex systems cannot be built gradually because intermediate stages would be non-functional and therefore not selectable. Natural selection, however, works only on functional intermediates. It cannot favor systems that don't yet work. And therefore, protein machines could not plausibly arise by unguided evolution. So conclusion, the best explanation is intelligent design. So like we said, this argument is vulnerable to the same objections Oppy raised against fine-tuning, notably the last 2 points, either from necessity or objective chance. Protein machine arguments, they raise no difficulty for naturalism. If all possible worlds share the same laws and initial history with our universe, the existence of protein machines is no problem for naturalism. On the one hand, says Oppy, it may be that all metaphysically or ontologically possible worlds contain protein machines. On the other, it may be that the future existence of protein machines depended upon the outworking of objective chance at earlier points in the history of the universe. Either way, there is no difficulty for naturalism on the assumption that all metaphysically or ontologically possible worlds share laws and initial history with the actual world, and diverge from the actual world only as a result of the outworkings of objective chance. So here again, all metaphysically possible worlds share the same laws and initial history as the actual world, and differ only because of objective chance. So we have 2 cases parallel to the fine-tuning discussion. It may be, given the laws of nature and the initial state of the universe, that protein machines were inevitable, meaning that there is no possible world in the relevant, metaphysical sense without them. If that's right, then their existence is not surprising. No probability calculation applies and no design explanation is required. In the second case, where the laws and initial conditions allow for multiple outcomes, some evolutionary paths lead to protein machines and others don't. In our world, chance events, mutation, contingencies, environmental changes, they led to their emergence. But since objective chance is already an accepted explanatory resource in naturalism, appealing to it is not ad hoc or problematic. So if protein machines are necessary, there is nothing to explain in probabilistic terms. And if protein machines arose by chance, chance plus loss is exactly what naturalism expects. So again, no difficulty. So that's it for the argument of protein machines. There is no need to expand more on it. One last question remains about what should naturalists accept. Oppy in the next paragraph is no longer using the restrictive modal view to answer fine-tuning or design arguments. Instead, he is asking whether naturalists should accept that restrictive view in the first place and how to defend it philosophically. I personally don't see what's the relevance of this because, he already answered to fine-tuning, but sure, why not? So he asks, should naturalists accept that all metaphysically or ontologically possible worlds share laws and initial history with the actual world and diverge from the actual world only as a result of the outworkings of objective chance? His answer is it's unclear. There are pros and cons. So now we are evaluating the costs and benefits of that model framework. If we accept that with the same set of natural laws operating in our universe, we can get other possible universes that share our universe's initial history but diverge from our universe as the result of chance. We then have 2 possible views. On the one hand, this assumption yields a parsimonious account of metaphysical or ontological possibility. On the other hand, it generates a promiscuous account of metaphysical or ontological necessity. So either a parsimonious account of possibility or a promiscuous account of necessity. So a parsimonious account of possibility means that you posit fewer possibilities. You restrict what counts as a genuine possible world instead of an infinity of worlds with different laws, constants, and structures. We get, one lawful structure, one initial history, and they diverge only through chance. That is, theoretically attractive, especially to naturalists who value ontological economy and explanatory restraint. Your ontological commitments have smaller costs than when you posit that there are, constraints about, what is, when you posit that there are, constraints about what is possible. A promiscuous account of necessity means now many things turn out to be necessary, and on this view, the laws of nature, constants, and perhaps chemistry, biology, and even, life are necessary. Should naturalists embrace either of these two views that derive from the one about possible worlds with the same laws and initial history? Well, this is where it is unclear because, as Oppy says, such accounts resist intuition, according to some, while the proponents of the view, intuition fails to reliably discriminate between metaphysical and ontological modality and epistemic or doxastic modality. So, some can say that reducing possibility or making everything necessary is counterintuitive because we can always conceive that things could have been otherwise. To say, for example, that the fine-tuned values might have been different, that there could be other fine-tuned possible words different from ours, isn't irrational or incoherent or inconsistent. But the proponents can say that we are conflating what is actually possible, ontological modality, and what is conceivably possible, the epistemic modality. The fact that we have a restraint on fine-tuned universes, limiting them by necessity, will be better for naturalists since it lowers their commitment costs. So a claim that argues that the fine-tuned values are metaphysically or ontologically necessary has more theoretical values. Has theoretical virtues. So it is better for naturalists to accept the claim that all possible words share laws and initial history with the actual word and diverge only from it, just because of objective chance only. So although restricting metaphysical possibility makes many features of the word come out as necessary, which can clash with our intuition, naturalists can reasonably accept this cost because intuition is unreliable about modality and overall, theoretical virtues favor treating things like fine-tuned constant as metaphysically necessary. Plus, we've seen that naturalists can accept that our universe is fine-tuned without worrying about, contradicting naturalism. Even if fine-tuning and protein machines offer slight support in favor of theism, like Plantinga argues, through his Bayesian probability, naturalists still don't have to worry. A slight support doesn't mean decisive proof. That would require more than just, a higher result in a Bayesian equation. Philosophical big questions, philosophical big pictures are assessed globally, not by single data points. So slight support can easily be outweighed by strong counter-evidence, theoretical costs, explanatory failures elsewhere, etc. So even granting Plantinga's modest claim, naturalism is not threatened. But this is just if we grant that Plantinga is right. Oppy goes as far as saying that there aren't even good reasons to suppose that Plantinga's argument offer indeed any support for theism. And this is whether naturalists accept that parsimonious account of possibility and the promiscuous account of necessity, or they don't. Even if we don't take those accounts and simply, look at which big picture offers better global explanations of the fine-tuned values, Like we just look at which one of theism or naturalism explains better that the universe is fine-tuned, there is no reason to suppose that theism offers a superior explanation. So the God did it explanation doesn't do anything, doesn't have any explanatory power. It doesn't do any better than it is fine-tuned out of necessity or because of chance. That being said, let's see why Plantinga believes that design discourses, arguments from fine-tuning and protein machines, they offer some support for theism over naturalism, and this is where we'll talk about Michael Behe. We already argued that even if such support exists, it doesn't matter because naturalism is still undefeated. But we will look at the argument anyways. Now, from the start, Plantinga, who claims that design discourse offers support for theism, also claims that it isn't easy to say how much support theism gets. But the point is, theism is supported by design discourse. So for a reminder, this chapter is about science defeating naturalism, and design discourse is taken to be a scientific discourse. Now, officially it is pseudoscience, but we will grant that it is science. We'll grant that it is scientific, it's a scientific claim that the universe shows signs of design. So given how neatly complex mechanisms come together to produce life, for example, when we describe the natural world, it's like we are describing a design. If it is a design, then it has to have a designer. And theism argues that there is a designer, while naturalism claims that there are no designers, and therefore design discourse, granted that it is scientific, supports theism, therefore science defeats naturalism. And this is Behe's design discourse, and it is inspired by William Paley's design discourse. So who's William Paley? Well, he was the 19th century and 18th century, 19th century English Anglican theologian, philosopher, and one of the most influential early proponents of the design argument for the existence of God. So he's essentially famous for the watchmaker analogy developed in his 1802 book, Natural Theology. And Oppy quotes from Plantinga, who refers to Paley's watchmaker argument. He says, "The belief that something or other is a product of design is not formed by way of inference, but in the basic way. That what goes on here is to be understood as more like perception than like inference. Sometimes Paley is calling attention to the sorts of beliefs we do in fact find ourselves forming or inclined to form. Other times what he seems to be doing can perhaps better be described as putting us in the sort of situations in which design beliefs are in fact formed. When you are on the walk with Paley and encounter a watch, you don't make an inference to the thought that this object is designed. Instead, upon examining the object, you form the belief in that immediate or basic sense, or basic way, sorry. So this is how the argument starts, and you certainly notice the argument doesn't try to prove that the universe is a design, but it starts by claiming that it is designed. We don't infer that the universe is designed, or that the brain, the human body, the protein machines are designed or product of design. Instead, we just perceive that they are products of design. Just like when you encounter a watch, if you find a watch on the ground, you won't infer that the watch is designed, but simply perceive that it is designed, just by, perceiving its mechanism. What you would infer is that the watch had a maker, because it would be counterintuitive for you to assume that the complexity, the order, and the fact that each thing in the watch is serving a clear function, all of these elements we are perceiving in the watch, it would be counterintuitive to assume that it was the product of chance or, natural forces only, or blind natural forces. So you infer a watchmaker from the perceived design. And Paley then says, living organisms, eyes, wings, organs, they show far greater function complexity than watches, and therefore they are even more strongly, they even more strongly imply a divine designer, which is God. So the first premise of the argument is that the universe is a design. We don't question that, we take it as a fact. Then the question becomes, which big picture does that belief that it is a design support? If I tell you this watch is designed, which big picture would be supported by this belief? that the watch is designed, that there is a watchmaker or that there is no watchmaker. So theists argue that it's obvious there is a watchmaker. So Plantinga calls these beliefs Paley's design beliefs. And sure, he admits that there can be rebuting defeaters to them, but I mean, do you remember what's a rebuting defeater? I have a belief P, then another belief Q shows up, and Q entails not P, and so P is rebutted. So the belief to rebut is that there is a watchmaker, not that the watch is a product of design. So that the watch or biological phenomena, because of course the watch has a watchmaker. So the proper move would be to show that the analogy is faulty, and that's what Oppy is doing in the next paragraph. But here, the belief to rebut is, it's not that biological phenomena are not designed, or they don't display features of design, but that it has a designer. Okay, the belief to rebut is that there is a designer. But how can naturalists rebut that belief that there is a designer? If P there is a designer, and this belief is supported by C, that biological phenomena are products of design, and naturalists believe that C, then to rebut P, naturalists must provide the features Q that the relevant biological phenomena were products by unguided Darwinian evolution. So, in other words, they need to show that from belief C, we infer that there is an unguided evolution or unguided Darwinian evolution, not that there is a designer. So C must entail or lean more towards Q, which entails not P, or makes the reasons for believing P not sufficient, or the degree of confidence that P is not reasonable. So of course, it's also possible to provide undercutting defeaters to Paley's design beliefs. Undercutting defeats are weaker versions of rebuting defeaters. They don't rebut Paley's design beliefs, but just make them unlikely to be true, or show that there is an unguided evolutionary path that is not prohibitively improbable. But while Plantinga argues that these defeaters are possible, naturalists still haven't been able to provide them. Plantinga insists, says Oppy, that naturalists have not shown that evolution is unguided, and this rules out rebuting defeaters to Paley's design beliefs. And Plantinga insists that, at best, current evolutionary science provides a partial undercutting defeater for those beliefs. But is this true? Well, it's certainly true concerning rebuting defeaters, but so is the other way around. When it comes to big pictures, it's a bit more complicated to rebut them. Neither naturalism nor theism can rebut one another, and Oppy doesn't claim that naturalism rebutes theism, but it does undercut it. Oppy gives one undercutting defeater. Just because a watch has a watchmaker, it doesn't mean that a tree has a tree maker too. So yeah, we don't reject that we perceive design, but we have to be careful with the words perceive and design. As Oppy says, while we can allow that we do perceive design in manufactured objects, e.g. the watch lying on the heath, I think that we should not accept Paley's account on how we perceive design in those objects. So what is wrong with Paley's notion of perception and design here? Well, Plantinga argues that when Paley says that we perceive design in manufactured objects, like a watch, what he means by design is the precision with which the various parts fit together to accomplish their function, the dependence of each part on others, and the like. So, to perceive design means to perceive that precision, where various parts fit together to accomplish a function and depend on one another. There are many things wrong with this claim, and there are at least two problems. First, precision, taken in the sense, doesn't necessarily mean design. It's design when it is actually designed like a watch, but it's not necessarily designed when it is an eyeball. Sure, a watch and an eyeball have similar features, but that's not enough to infer that they both have a maker. That's why the analogy doesn't work. So to avoid making these confusions, we should keep the term design for man-made things. The truth is that we perceive design in such objects where we perceive materials that we know are the products of human labor: brass, cogwheels, plastics, thin sheets of glass, engraved letters, and the like. So with this, we can already say that it's not sufficient to infer the existence of a designer from the mere perception that products of human labor have a designer and that biological phenomena resemble in some way those man-made products. Plus the second problem, there is a big controversial claim in Paley, which is that design also means functionality and dependence on the parts. That precision, Paley calls design, has the characteristic of serving a function. So if it serves a function, it is designed. And sure, why not? But that doesn't mean that if it is designed, then it serves a function. Paley takes it to mean that if I can spot a design, then I spot something serving a function. But that's just wrong. We can identify design without necessarily spotting its function or knowing about its function. Sure, that doesn't mean that the thing didn't have a function, I just happen not to know it. But for Paley to be able to perceive it as design, I need to also perceive its function. The same also is true for the dependence of the parts. We can identify design without knowing anything about the dependence of the parts. Plus, like we said with the previous problem, even if something has a function, it doesn't mean that it was made with an intention for it to have that function. And we can also claim the opposite. Yes, we can identify design without knowing the function or the dependence, but we can also miss the design even when it fits Paley's definition. We can just miss the design altogether, but we perceive a function. And this is a problem for Paley because he takes this ability to perceive design as inherent and intuitive. But what seems as design for some people may not seem design for others. Like this faculty of being presented with the precision that Paley describes, and we go like, oh, design, this isn't uniform across people because of their different cultural backgrounds, probably. So that's the second problem. We can identify design without knowing their function or dependence, and your ability to perceive design can also be predicated on an a priori. You have a cultural bias that encourages you to see things in nature as designed. You see plants, animals, and eyeballs as designed because you already believe that they are designed. So Oppy says, on the one hand, we correctly identify objects as designed even when we have no knowledge of their function or the dependence of their parts or the like. And on the other hand, there is plainly no uniform tendency amongst people to discern design in many cases where parts fit together precisely to accomplish function, parts depend upon one another, and so forth. Sure, those who already believe that animals and plants are the product of design may profess to perceive design in animals and plants on the basis of precise fitting together of parts to accomplish function and so forth. But the rest of us make no such professions. So, what to conclude from this criticism of Paley's design beliefs? Well, two things. We cannot infer from our perception of design in manufactured objects that natural objects are also designed, and that given the strong tendency that perception is shaped by prior biases, we should be aware of beliefs like Paley's. We should suspect that they are not reliable. So as Oppy says, the upshot here is A, that the way that we actually perceive design in manufactured objects has no legitimate extension to the case of plants and animals, and B, that given A, there are obvious grounds for worry about pollution by prior theory in the case of those who profess to perceive design in animals and plants. So that is an undercutting the feature. A doesn't entail that the universe isn't designed. It just argues that we cannot infer that it is designed from the perception of the precision it has. And B, it doesn't entail that, such beliefs are wrong, but that we shouldn't expect them to be unreliable. So, like we should expect them to be unreliable. So, what do we do from here? Well, now we just apply this criticism to Behe's design discourse and his protein machine. Since it's just an updated version of Paley, it must be vulnerable to the same problems. So, to quote Oppy, according to Plantinga, the complex structures and molecular machines that Behe discusses certainly appear to be designed. But the complex structures and molecular machines that Behe discusses are not composed of materials that we know are the product of human labor. And there is plainly no uniform tendency among people to discern design in these complex structures and molecular machines. So there you have A and B applied to Behe's machines. Can Plantinga provide any defeater or defeat deflector to this? Well, according to Oppy, he can try to argue that if we lack the tendency to perceive design in Behe structures and machines, it's because we have some kind of cognitive deficit, but clearly, unless he can logically prove that we are missing something, there is no reason to revise the naturalist position. Usually, when theists are confronted with sound and valid defeaters, they will revert to psychology or invoke some non-natural explanation for why you are still not convinced of the truth, of their belief. They'll appeal to something like you have anger issues, or your arrogance blinds you to God's love, or just say that your refusal to see God's design is the outworking of original sin or the like. It may be that your heart is shut to the Lord's grace, or that you are being manipulated by the devil or whatever. But that simply amounts to saying that naturalists aren't being objective, and that their judgment is being clouded by something. However, naturalists can say just as much about theists, that they are being biased from the start, that Plantinga and theists are like him. They are here relying on theory to interpret data. It is only those who already believe that God exists who suppose that the complex structure and molecular machines are properly perceived to be products of design. So the difference is that at least naturalists, they don't have an obvious bias as theists. Our biases, don't appeal to any non-natural entity or power. When we exhibit bias or a priori theory, it would still be aligned with notions used uncontroversially in science. We don't appeal to the workings of sin or the devil, or that your heart is shut to the truth or to the love of God. So all of this to say that design discourse, fine-tuning, protein machines, etc., they don't offer support for theism over naturalism. As a matter of fact, they provide none to theism. All it does is just reaffirm a prior belief, which is theism. So to take design discourse as support for theism means that you already believe in theism, actually. You are seeing design everywhere because you believe a priori that everything is designed. Now, again, Oppy isn't here telling you that you have to prove theism. He's completely fine with, starting with an a priori. The problem is the claim that design discourse supports that a priori, which is theism, over another person's different a priori, like here, naturalism. That's what you have to prove. And unfortunately, Plantinga isn't able to make a case for that. If science is to defeat naturalism by supporting theism over naturalism because science supports design discourse, it has to be proven that design discourse favors theism over naturalism, which remains to be done. As Oppy says, appearance of design tracks prior belief and so cannot be taken to be any kind of vindication of that belief. Rather than providing non-negligible support for theism, design discourse provides no differential support for either theism or naturalism. So this brings us to the third and last aspect of Plantinga's claim that theism is preferable over naturalism, and that is the claim that there is deep concord between theism and science, whereas there is deep conflict between naturalism and science. So why does Plantinga think that there is such concord between theism and science? Well, here's why. Theistic religion, and in particular the doctrine of Imago Dei, gives us reason to expect our cognitive capabilities or capacities to match the world in such a way as to make modern science possible. Naturalism gives us no reason at all to expect this sort of match. From the point of view of naturalism, it would be an overwhelming piece of cosmic serendipity if there were such a match. So this is the concord between theism and science. It starts with this: there is a match between our cognitive capabilities or capacities and the world. The world is governed by stable, discoverable laws, deep mathematical structures, unobservable mechanisms like fields, particles, molecular machines, etc. And these features make the world intelligible, right? Well, it also happens that our cognitive faculties are suited to the world's intelligible structure. Humans possess faculty capable of forming abstract mathematics, of constructing theories about unobservable mechanisms, long chains of inference, etc. It's like our minds are attuned to the deep structure of reality in a way that allows prediction, explanation, developing technology, etc. In other words, this match between our mind and the structure of reality makes science possible. The condition of science is this match. Without it, we won't be able to do scientific inquiry. And here too, the point isn't to prove whether that match actually exists, but to ask which big picture is most supported by that match which we all supposedly experience and cannot deny. In other words, we ask, if naturalism is true, would we be able to even experience that match? Do we have any reason to suppose that our minds and the structure of the world match in that way as to produce science if naturalism is true? Plantinga says no. Theists can give us such reason to believe that there is a match, but naturalism cannot. And therefore science supports theism. The fact that you are able to do science presupposes theism. So that is the main claim. If we look at it in details, we find that it is made of 6 different claims that Oppy outlines. So here they are. According to Plantinga, first, God has created a universe that is regular and predictable and has constituted so constituted us that we can recognize those regularities and predictabilities. 2. God has created a universe that obeys laws and has so constituted us that we can grasp those laws. Moreover, those laws are necessary or inviolable because no creature has the power to act contrary to omnipotent fiat. 3. God has created a universe that is mathematically describable and has also given us the ability to grasp and practice the kind of mathematics that describe that universe. Moreover, we can gain knowledge of numbers and sets because they are divine thoughts and we are causally related to them by way of our causal relationships with God. 4. God has created a universe in which inductive reasoning is successful and has so constituted us that we reason inductively. 5. God has created a universe that exhibits certain kinds of simplicity and has so constituted us that our intellectual success requires the world to be simple in just those kinds of ways. And 6. God's creation of the universe is contingent, both in its nature and its existence, and this explains the empirical character of science. So this is Plantinga's claim in its details, that there is a parallel between how God made the universe and how he made us. The universe is regular and predictable, it obeys necessary or inviolable laws, it is mathematically describable, it is suited for inductive reasoning, and it exhibits certain simplicity, and it is contingent. And luckily, God made us so that we don't get lost in that universe. We are capable of seeing the universe's regularities and predictabilities, grasping its laws, grasping and practicing the math that, describes it. We are capable of reasoning inductively. We see the universe's simplicity and usually lean towards the simplest theories to understand the universe. And our science is empirical because the universe is contingent. Plus, how convenient that numbers and sets are divine thoughts. Like how great that God thinks in numbers and we are made so that we can grasp God's thoughts, right? It's like we are made in his own image or something. So we are causally related to God and so causally related to his thoughts. It's like saying God made the world in a certain way and gave you eyes to see it. That there is a match between how the world is and your eyes. How can you explain that? Naturalism. If there weren't a God, can you expect that things would match like this? If God doesn't exist, will you expect the banana to fit in your hand? Those who know, they know. So for Plantinga, you cannot explain this match except through God did it. Like what? You're gonna trust evolution? You're gonna trust that this match happened by random chance? Like some sort of unguided blind process somehow made it that our cognitive faculties and the structure of the world match? Of course, I'm caricaturing a little bit here, but that's truly how the theist argument goes. Without presupposing a God, you would have no reason to trust your cognitive faculties because you cannot suppose that there is really a match between your faculties, or what your faculties are telling you about the structure of the world and the actual structure of the world. But you seemingly trust your mind, so you must presuppose God. If we are going to boil down the argument, we would have something like this. You see that a road is stretching in front of you, so you keep walking. But why do you trust your eyes? Who says that there is actually a road there and not a cliff? If you trust your eyes that in front of you there is a road and you won't fall to your death, then you must also presuppose God, because only his existence guarantees that there is a match between what your eyes are perceiving and the actual world in front of you. So recently, this kind of argument was championed by Irish mathematician John Lennox. Theists have a reason to trust their mind, thereby trusting science, while atheists and naturalists, if they are consistent, they cannot trust their mind and thus they cannot trust or do science. So the question then becomes, do naturalists consistently have reasons to trust their mind, given, that they deny the existence of God? And the answer is, well, obviously yes. The account of possibility and necessity that we mentioned in the previous section supports that. We said that naturalists can consistently accept the parsimonious account of possibility and the promiscuous account of necessity. Oppy says that this account gives support to trusting our minds and believing that our mind, and the world match. So we agree that there is a match, just like the theists do, and see if it makes sense on that account. Theists say that they can justify that match because their account, their belief in God, makes the match plausible. But naturalists, well, they can do the same with their account of necessity. Their account is that the universe couldn't have been otherwise, or even if it were, the possibility of different worlds is very restricted. So you won't find words that differ so radically that they share neither similar laws nor an initial history, and so all possible words will be by necessity intelligible. So a word where you have such laws but somehow isn't intelligible would imply that the physical laws from which minds have resulted aren't the same physical laws in their nature from which the world has resulted. So this will be contradictory to the account on possibility and necessity. In other words, the account of possibility and necessity argues that it is out of necessity that the match exists, and not out of random, unguided, chaotic chance like theists suppose. So as Oppy says, it is necessary that our universe is mathematically describable and necessary that our universe is regular and predictable, and necessary that our universe obeys the laws of nature, and necessary that our universe supports inductive reasoning, and necessary that our universe exhibits certain kinds of simplicity, and necessary that that any scientific inquiry will have an empirical character. Moreover, on that account, it is necessary that any sufficiently intelligent evolved creatures are so constituted that creatures of their kind can recognize regularities and predictability, reason inductively, develop some grasp of laws, use mathematics for description and prediction, discern simplicity, underlying complexity, and so forth. For these naturalists, it is plainly not true that it is merely an overwhelming piece of cosmic serendipity that our cognitive capacities match the world in ways that make modern science possible. So serendipity means a lucky move. So naturalism apparently has no difficulty answering to the match argument. A possible answer to this is that theists can hold that it is both necessary that God exists and necessary that if God creates universes, then God creates universes with intelligible structures, and that those universes contain intelligent creatures who recognize the structure of both of those universes. But this is just adding to the naturalist explanation of necessity, the necessity of God's existence. which adds no explanatory power whatsoever to the match between our cognitive capacities and the world in ways, to make science possible. So since it's already necessary that there has to be that match, then adding on the necessity of God's existence is irrelevant and provides no further explanation to the match. It's ironically just an unnecessary ontological commitment. All of the explanatory heavy lifting, as Oppy says, ultimately adverts to primitive metaphysical and ontological necessity. The additional commitments of theism purchase no advantage in connection with any of the considerations currently on the table. So indeed, is the necessity of the match predicated on the necessity of God's existence? Is there an inherent causal relationship between these two necessities? And if so, theists need to tell us why and how, and that is no easy task. If God's existence is necessary, and that the match is also necessary because God is necessary, then there's a greater, more primitive principle of necessity that governs God. It means, given that the match is necessary, that God cannot do otherwise but to make a universe with the match. So belief in God is kind of irrelevant. If, however, the match isn't necessary, then it would mean that they, both theists and naturalists, can accept that there are possible universes without the match. These would be universes that are not mathematically describable, not regular, not predictable, not obedient to natural law, not supportive of inductive reasoning, not relevantly simple, and not investigable by way of scientific inquiry with an empirical character. So in short, these will be unintelligible universes. If such universes are possible, then for theists, this would mean that God can have the intention to create them. So he can intentionally create universes with the match, just like he can create universes without the match. Given that by Plantinga's own light, the intentions of God can never be known to us, then theists have no explanation other than the famous God did it because he did it because shut up, for why God actually had the intention to make the universe a universe with a match rather than the intention to make a universe without the match. I'll just say with match or without match instead of universe that is mathematically blah blah blah. So to sum up, whether the match is contingent or necessary, theism, well, it ain't got shit on naturalism. There is ultimately no difference between naturalism and theism when it comes to the explanation of the fact that the universe is with the match. Ultimately, in each case, we have an explanatory cert. So, as Oppy says, at first it looks like theism has an advantage over naturalism because it has an informative answer to the question, why is the universe with a match? And the answer is, God did it, or more precisely, God intended to do it. But then if we ask, why did God have the intention to make a universe with the match? Well, theism is at loss here. It cannot provide any answer, whereas that question does not so much as arise, for naturalism. So we conclude that, seen from the proper perspective, there is no advantage for theism here. Alright then, given that theism has no advantage over naturalism, let's focus on naturalism. What should naturalists say about the fact that our cognitive capacities match the world in ways that make modern science possible? Again, we're not questioning the fact that the match exists, just what to make of it. At the beginning, theism argued that only it can make sense of the match's existence, hence implying that deep concord between theism and science exists. We've seen that it's not the case, that theism has no explanatory advantage over naturalism. So does this mean that naturalism has the deep concord with science? Well, we can say yes, but Oppy highlights that what naturalists say about the fact that the match exists, theists can agree on it too. Like this applies for both parties. So both of them should go for the necessary explanation. Both should say that there can only be a match between our cognitive capacities and the universe if the universe is intelligible. Okay, so both theists and naturalists can accept this. Start with claiming that the universe is by necessity intelligible. Now, just because the universe is intelligible, it doesn't mean that there is a match between the universe and our cognitive faculties. If there is no creature or no life, then there is no cognitive faculty, so there is no match. But we can postulate that we are the only creatures with cognitive faculties that match the universe. Birds have cognitive faculties, but maybe they don't match the structure of the universe, or maybe the universe has a specific structure for birds or whatever. So that's irrelevant. The point is, at some point in the universe's history, we exist. Human beings have cognitive faculties, and those faculties, they match the universe's structure. But if creatures exist, or at least creatures like us, possessing the kind of capacities that we have, we can say that it is necessary that the match exists. For a human being to exist, meaning for a being to have the cognitive capacities that we as humans in fact possess, then the match has to exist. You cannot have a human being, a creature with the faculties that you and I have, in an intelligible world, and somehow there is no match. Like, that scenario is impossible. And this goes both ways. If you have a creature like us who has these capacities, then it cannot exist in a universe that isn't intelligible. Our existence is only possible if the universe is also intelligible. So we should say that it is necessary, both for our existence and for our possession of the cognitive capacities that we in fact have, that the universe is mathematically describable, regular, predictable, obedient to natural law, supportive of inductive reasoning, relevantly simple and apt for scientific inquiry with an empirical character, in short, intelligible. Moreover, I think both parties should say that if the universe is mathematically, if the universe is intelligible, apt for scientific inquiry with an empirical character, etc., then it is more or less inevitable that there is some kind of match between the universe and the cognitive capacities of any kinds of beings in the universe that have cognitive capacities. So there, if the universe is intelligible and there are creatures like us, which can only be, like us, because the universe is intelligible, then it is almost certain that there will be a match. And this should be acceptable for both parties. Theists can hold on to their theism, they can add, that extra commitment to the existence of God, but whether that God exists adds nothing to explaining the match. Concerning the match, both theists and naturalists can agree. Then Oppy adds another claim that both parties can also accept. And this is perhaps the most controversial because it involves evolution. And the rest of the section is a chronological account of human evolution. So both parties should accept that it is not surprising that, quote, our universe contains creatures, including human beings, that make reasonably advanced cognitive performance, given that it has been witness to 5 billion years of life on the surface of the earth. Now sure, given that we are giving a necessity account of the match shouldn't surprise us. Even if we appeal to incredible odds, the fact that the match is necessary, these odds shouldn't overwhelm us. But theists can still argue, and this is, the controversy. And by the way, this will lead us to the second part of the chapter, which we will read next week. So theists can still argue that what is surprising is that human beings exist, that creatures have developed cognitive faculties so advanced like ours without divine intervention. So they may agree that when you have an intelligible universe and creatures like us, it is inevitable and necessary that there will be a match. but the problem resides in how those creatures came into being in the first place. For them, it may be that it is deeply improbable that creatures whose faculties match the universe arise from an unguided biological process. But again, this presupposes that only human beings have capacities that match the structure of the universe. But what prevents us from saying that a snail has abilities that match the structure of the universe relevant to a snail? On that account, we can say that any form of life has matching capacities with the structure of the universe, that the universe is intelligible to all forms of life, since all forms of life interact with its environment, and successfully so interacts with its environment. So matches wouldn't surprise us, right? But let's suppose that by intelligible we mean intelligible for human beings specifically. Intelligible is, as Oppy and Plantinga says, mathematically describable, regular, predictable, obedient to natural laws, supportive of inductive reasoning, relevantly simple, apt for scientific inquiry with an empirical character. All right? Well, Oppy still argues that we can see that that as a result of necessity because of that giving. So let's read it again. There is nothing surprising about the fact that our universe contains creatures, including human beings, that make reasonably advanced cognitive performance, given that the universe has been witness to 4 billion years of life on the surface of the earth. So the universe spent 4 billion years witnessing life developing on Earth. The universe is 14 billion years old, and life that we know of has been around for 4 billion years, so life has been around for about a third of the universe's time span. And it existed for most of Earth's history. The Earth is 4.5 billion years, which means that it only spent 500 million years lifeless, about 11% of its time only. When you look at it, this way, it didn't take that long for life to emerge on Earth, right? But the universe has 4 billion years to witness life's evolution. 4 billion years. That's a very long time. A lot can happen in 4 billion years. So our existence as human beings didn't happen overnight, but it was a series of a very long and unpredictable evolutionary process. Surely it's not, unreasonable to suppose that in such a long period of time, a long period of evolution, trying and improvising many things, different combinations, something like our species would eventually appear. So I'll just jump right to the conclusion of this section and then read what Oppy says about our species evolution, just for those who are interested in knowing this, because it's not really that important for Oppy's argument. So I'll just conclude this section, and then if you want, you can skip to the conclusion, to the concluding remarks on this first part of the chapter. So what's the takeaway, from this discussion on human evolution? Well, that there is nothing surprising about our cognitive performances. With 4 billion years of life evolving, it won't be surprised that some species would come out as outstanding in terms of cognitive abilities in relation to other species. And that these cognitive abilities have allowed us to develop other abilities, which in turn further developed cognitive abilities. Oppy is talking about the ability to create cultures, for example. Our cognitive performance isn't just, due to our biological endowment along the lines of evolution. Our biological endowment also allowed us to develop social and cultural endowment as well, which also fueled our biological endowment, creating some sort of, feedback loop between our two endowments. Which accelerated even more our cognitive development. So that we are the species that we are is unsurprising for Oppy. There is nothing surprising about us being capable of, developing science, cultures, philosophy, art, etc. And there is nothing surprising about the match. To quote Oppy's conclusion, the cognitive performance of human beings and their hominid ancestors has also been a matter of social and cultural endowment, and the advanced nature of that cognitive performance is unsurprising, giving one its foundation in the preceding 4 billion years of merely biological evolution, and two, the advances that are made possible by social and cultural evolution. Moreover, the fit between the cognitive performance of human beings and the universe in which they live is unsurprising, given the way that human beings have developed, ranging from excellent in the most basic areas to woeful in the most controversial areas: religion, politics, philosophy, and the like. In particular, that human cognitive performance fits the world in such a way as to make science possible seems entirely unsurprising in the light of the history that we have been reviewing. Okay, so now we can jump on to the next section if you want, to the concluding remarks, or stay to learn briefly about what led human beings to their cognitive performances from the standing point of evolution. So here are a few things. Prokaryotes appeared at least 3.6 billion years ago. Eukaryotes appeared at least 2 billion years ago. These are the two most fundamental types of cellular life. You can say it's the earliest forms of life. No animals yet, just bacteria and fungi. The simplest animals, they date back at least 600 million years. The earliest mammals appeared at least 200 million years. Some claim that in that period, around 500 million years ago, rudimentary cognitive capacities appeared, which isn't at all a controversial claim. We also estimate that the common ancestors of gorillas, chimpanzees, and human beings inhabited the world no more than 5 million years ago. And these ancestors, they had cognitive capacities that were entirely shaped by their biological endowment. Oppy doesn't deny that such creatures have a match between the structure of the world and their cognitive abilities. He just says that this match or fit is easily explained. There is no mystery about it because it is explained by plain biology. So their brains were simply wired to see the world in that way for mere adaptive, pragmatic, and survival purposes. In short, it is plausible and an inevitable consequence of biological evolution that basic cognitive capacities shaped entirely by biological endowment match the environments in which they evolve. Then 2.3 million years ago, the earliest hominids appeared with brains the size of chimpanzees and who use simple stone tools. And this is about when we, humans, broke off from our common ancestor with chimpanzees and gorillas. So let's remind that people, did not evolve from apes, but that we are apes, okay? And all apes have evolved from the same ancestor. All right, so 5 million years ago, there were no apes, okay, no humans, no chimps, no gorillas. There was this common ancestor that we don't know what it looked like or even, what to name it, just ancestral apes or the hominine LCA, the acronym for Last Common Ancestor. But then that population split into different lineages about 2.3 million years ago, and one lineage led to gorillas, another lineage later split into chimpanzees and humans, which means that it is only recently, compared with history of evolution, that our cognitive capacities evolved in independence from the cognitive capacities of gorillas and chimpanzees. So, another misconception, gorillas and chimpanzees aren't non-evolved humans. They are evolved creatures that have little in common with our common ancestor. They evolved independently of it and of us and of each other. So yes, it is true that our evolutionary path, that of human beings, is outstanding compared to theirs in terms of differences in cognitive performance between us and the other primates. Oppy gives two sources about these differences. First, about learning and intelligence. He draws this from German psychologist Wolfgang Kohler from his 1925 book, The Mentality of Apes. Oppy argues among all other primates, Only some chimpanzees have achieved some linguistic competence, like learning to recognize hundreds of symbols. And some chimpanzees and gorillas exhibit some general domain intelligence, like problem-solving behavior. But they are outclassed by young human children. Then there are differences in transmission of knowledge. Some groups of primates have been observed to create and share new customs and behaviors. And Oppy mentions the 1999 study, Cultures and Chimpanzees, by Andrew Wythen and his colleagues. I think that's how it is pronounced, Wythen. They study macaque. I think that's how it is pronounced. In French, it is macaque. I don't remember how to pronounce it in English. But I'm gonna say macaque monkeys on Koshima, who developed the practice of washing sweet potatoes in the ocean to enhance their texture and flavor, but no primates engage in institutionalized cultural instruction, for example, or the like. So these differences were of three kinds: biological, social, and cultural. Like hominid communities, they are more complex than chimpanzees, than chimpanzee communities. Cultural bequests across generations of hominids are more significant, and cognitive performance exceeds chimpanzee performance. So humans outperform other primates in all types of differences, although it is unclear exactly how to explain these differences in performance. It can be because human performance isn't just explained by biological endowment, that our break from the common ancestor, besides our biological endowment, was also because we developed cultural and social endowment too. So these differences accumulated together, creating feedback loops. Each one enhances the other. Biological advances were amplified by social and cultural advances, and social and cultural advances were facilitated by biological advances, etc. But what's interesting is that these differences, they started to appear when hominids broke off from the same ancestor that they shared with chimps about 2 million years ago. Though the first hominids had brains the size of chimpanzees' brains, if the differences appeared 2 million years ago, then these differences appeared very rapidly. Like 1.5 million years ago, Homo erectus appeared with brains double the size of the first hominids. We started to learn to use fire and more complex stone tools, and this is where the big leap occurred, because you might have noticed a doubling of brain size in about 1 million years is extremely rapid in terms of evolutionary terms. But still, it's not God that made the brain of these early hominids double in size. We actually have many evolutionary theories about why that happened, and one of the leading theories is the expansive tissue hypothesis. We got bigger brains because of an energy trade-off with other parts of our bodies, which were necessary in order to survive in changing environments. So that period corresponds to the beginning of the Pleistocene, which is a period in the Earth's history from 2.5 million years ago to 11,000 years ago. And it was marked by extreme climate changes, which can explain, the unusual necessity for developing unusual ways to adapt, which can, result in rapid brain size growth. Again, no god of the gops needed for this. Then, 400,000 years ago, Homo sapiens, the forerunner of anatomically modern human beings, they appeared, followed by anatomically modern human beings 200,000 years later in Africa, and started to spread no more than 100,000 years ago. And so here we are. So that was a bit of history of human evolution. And now let's end this episode with the interim conclusion, which are conclusions about the middle of the chapter. So the conclusion is that as far as planting gas argument goes in the three first parts of this book, because Oppy's critique so far only covers the first three parts of where the conflict really lies, but as far as it goes, the argument fails. It tried to argue in favor of merely superficial conflict and merely apparent conflict and a deep concord between theism and science, thereby affirming that theism is preferable over naturalism and thus concluding that science defeats naturalism. But it turns out it's not so. So, to quote Oppy, in sum, Plantinga fails to establish that there is much merely alleged conflict between theism and science, and Plantinga fails to establish that there is some superficial conflict, but much deep concord between theism and science. For all that, Plantinga says in the first three parts of where the conflict really lies, it may be that there is deep conflict between theism and science, and it may be that there is much deeper concord between naturalism and science than there is between theism and science. Theism and science. So, of course, to say this is not to say that the large claims for which Plantinga argues in the first three parts of where the conflict really lies are mistaken. Moreover, a final assessment of the standing of those large claims cannot be made without first considering the strength of the case that Plantinga makes for the existence of deep conflict between naturalism and science. Consequently, we now turn to an examination of Plantinga's evolutionary argument against naturalism. So that's Plantinga's argument, but of course it's not over yet. There is still the fourth part, which will still try to argue in favor of the deep concord between theism and science, and this is by trying to defend the claim that in fact evolutionary biology supports theism. And this is called the EAN, or EAAN, the evolutionary argument against naturalism, and we will go through it next week. So that's it for today. I hope that it was clear. I hope that you enjoyed it. As always, like, subscribe, leave a comment, share the video.